Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The radio had been crackling static for the better part of an hour when Wiley Garrison finally shut it off. He'd been hauling refrigerated goods from Tulsa down through the Oklahoma Panhandle, a route he'd driven hundreds of times in his 23 years behind the wheel. The load was time-sensitive, pharmaceutical supplies headed for a distribution center in Amarillo, and he was already running 2 hours behind schedule thanks to a blown tire outside of Enid. The replacement had cost him time he couldn't afford to lose, not with the bonus payment tied to an on-time delivery. Wiley needed that money. His daughter's wedding was in 6 weeks, and he'd promised her father would take care of the rehearsal dinner. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was missing most of her life on the road to pay for the few moments he could actually be present. The sky had taken on that particular shade of green that every plains dweller recognized instinctively. It was the color of danger, the color that preceded the kind of storms that could flip a loaded semi like it was made of tin foil. Wiley had seen his share of twisters over the years, had even outrun a few, but he'd never gotten comfortable with that sickly green light that seemed to emanate from the clouds themselves rather than the dying sun behind them. The air pressure had dropped significantly in the last 30 minutes, making his ears pop repeatedly, and the wind had died to an unnatural stillness that set every nerve in his body on edge. In the distance, perhaps 15 miles to the southwest, he could see the dark wall of the storm system approaching, a massive shelf cloud that stretched across the entire horizon like God's own curtain being drawn across the world. He'd tried calling the distribution center to let them know he might need to find shelter, but his cell phone had no signal. That wasn't unusual out here in no man's land, as locals called this stretch of the Panhandle. The cell towers were few and far between, and the flat emptiness seemed to swallow radio waves as efficiently as it swallowed everything else. The CB radio in his truck had been dead for 2 months, another repair he'd been putting off, and now he was paying for that negligence with the particular anxiety of being completely cut off from the world with a major storm bearing down on his position. The highway stretched out before him in a perfectly straight line, vanishing into the heat shimmer on the horizon, and there wasn't another vehicle in sight in either direction. The isolation was total and absolute. Wiley checked his mirrors for the 100th time, a nervous habit he'd developed over the years. The storm was definitely gaining on him, moving faster than seemed natural. He'd heard stories from other drivers about these panhandle storms, how they could go from distant threat to immediate danger in a matter of minutes. The sky directly overhead was still that weird green, but the wall cloud behind him had darkened to nearly black, and he could see the telltale rotation in the clouds that suggested tornado formation. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he pressed the accelerator down a little further, pushing the truck up to 75, which was probably stupid given what he was carrying. But the alternative was worse. Getting caught in the open during a tornado in a vehicle this size was practically a death sentence. The first drops of rain hit his windshield about 10 minutes later, fat and heavy and coming down at an odd angle despite the lack of wind. Wiley turned on his wipers, but they barely made a dent in the deluge that followed. Within seconds, the rain was coming down so hard he could barely see 20 feet in front of his truck. He had to slow down to 50, then 40, then 35, leaning forward in his seat and squinting through the windshield as if getting a few inches closer would somehow improve visibility. The highway disappeared entirely in the sheets of water, and he was navigating more by instinct and memory than actual sight. Lightning cracked across the sky, close enough that he felt it in his fillings, and the thunder that followed was immediate and deafening. That's when he saw the sign, barely visible through the storm. Last Chance Service Station, 2 miles. Wiley knew the place, or at least he thought he did. It was one of those old-style gas stations that had been slowly dying out since the interstate system bypassed most of these small highways. He'd stopped there once or twice over the years, back when it was still operational, run by a weather-beaten old man who told elaborate stories about the Dust Bowl while pumping gas. But that had been years ago, maybe a decade, and Wiley was pretty sure the place had closed down. Still, even an abandoned gas station would offer more protection than being caught in the open when that tornado touched down. And from the sound of the wind that was picking up around his truck, that was going to happen any minute now. He almost missed the turnoff, only spotting it at the last second because a lightning flash illuminated the faded sign. Wiley cranked the wheel hard, feeling the truck's back end start to slide on the rain-slicked road before the tires caught, and he managed to straighten out. The access road was gravel, or had been once, but now it was mostly just mud and potholes that jarred his teeth every few feet. The gas station materialized out of the rain like something from a fever dream, a low concrete block building with 2 ancient pumps out front and a covered area that might provide some shelter for his truck. The windows were dark, and several of them were broken, covered with plywood that had warped and split over the years. The place looked like it had been abandoned for a lot longer than a decade. Wiley pulled the truck under the covered area, which groaned ominously but held. He killed the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the rain hammer against the metal roof above him and the increasingly violent wind that was making his truck rock on its suspension. The storm had arrived with a vengeance, and he could hear debris striking the building and the pavement around him. Through the rain, he could barely make out what looked like an old tornado shelter entrance around the back of the building. One of those angled metal doors set into a concrete foundation that led to an underground room. If this got worse, that might be his only option. For now, he was relatively safe in the truck, and he took a moment to check his phone. Still no signal. He tried the ignition again, thinking maybe he could get the radio to work, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The starter clicked a few times and then nothing. Wiley felt a flutter of real fear in his chest. He knew trucks, had been maintaining his own rig for years, and that sound meant a dead battery, which made absolutely no sense. The battery had been fine 30 seconds ago. He tried again, pumping the accelerator, but got the same result. Dead as a doornail, his father would have said. The rain was showing no signs of letting up, and the wind was getting stronger. Wiley could see a trash can rolling past his truck, carried by the wind like it weighed nothing. A sheet of corrugated metal flew past, missing his side mirror by inches. The whole truck was shaking now, and he made the decision. He needed to get into that storm shelter before this got any worse. He pulled his jacket tight around himself, grabbed his flashlight from the glove box, and pushed open the door. The wind nearly ripped it out of his hand, and the rain was coming down so hard it actually hurt when it hit his face. He jumped down from the cab and immediately sank ankle-deep in mud. The storm shelter was around the back, maybe 50 feet away, but it felt like a mile. Wiley put his head down and pushed forward, fighting the wind every step of the way. The rain was blinding, and lightning was striking close enough that he could smell ozone in the air. Something large flew past his head, close enough that he felt the air displacement, but he didn't stop to look at what it was. His boots kept sticking in the mud, and twice he almost fell, catching himself at the last second. The roar of the wind was so loud he couldn't hear his own breathing. He found the shelter entrance more by luck than navigation, nearly tripping over it in the darkness. The metal doors were secured with a heavy padlock that looked newer than anything else about this place, which struck him as odd, but he didn't have time to think about it. Wiley grabbed the lock and pulled, and to his surprise it popped open. It hadn't been properly secured, just threaded through the hasp to look locked. He threw the doors open, and they slammed back against the concrete with a metallic crash that was immediately swallowed by the storm. A set of concrete steps led down into darkness. Wiley hesitated for just a moment, shining his flashlight down into the shelter. The beam didn't penetrate very far, and he couldn't see the bottom of the stairs. Every instinct he had was screaming at him that something about this wasn't right. The lock that wasn't locked, the darkness below, the way the shelter entrance had seemed almost deliberately easy to find. But then a sound like a freight train roared overhead, and he knew that sound. Tornado. Close. He didn't have a choice anymore. He took the first step down into the darkness, then the second. The sound of the storm immediately became muffled, dampened by the concrete walls around him. By the fifth step, he could barely hear it at all, which should have been a relief but somehow wasn't. Wiley kept going, counting steps in his head, 10, 11, 12. The stairs went down much deeper than seemed necessary for a simple storm shelter. At 15 steps, his flashlight beam finally found the bottom, illuminating a concrete floor that was surprisingly clean, free of the dirt and debris he'd expected to find in an abandoned shelter. The room at the bottom was larger than he'd anticipated, maybe 20 feet square, with concrete walls and a low ceiling reinforced with steel beams. There was a single bulb hanging from a wire in the center of the room, and to Wiley's shock, when he reached up and pulled the chain, it lit up. Weak and flickering, but it worked. That meant the place had power, which made no sense at all for an abandoned gas station. The room was empty, except for a few wooden crates stacked against one wall and what looked like an old military cot in the corner. The air smelled strange, not musty like he'd expected, but chemical, like cleaning supplies or maybe bleach. Wiley stood there for a long moment, water dripping from his clothes onto the clean concrete floor, and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The light worked. The floor was clean. The air smelled like someone had recently cleaned this place. But the gas station above had clearly been abandoned for years, windows broken, building falling apart. It didn't add up. He walked over to the crates and examined them more closely. They were made of rough wood, unmarked, and sealed shut with dozens of nails. He tried to lift one, but it was too heavy to even budge. Whatever was in there, there was a lot of it. That's when he heard it. A sound from above, from inside the building. Not the storm, not the wind. Footsteps. Someone was walking around up there. Wiley froze, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. He'd been so sure the place was abandoned, but clearly he'd been wrong. Maybe it was the owner, someone who still maintained this shelter even though the business was closed. That would explain the power, the cleanliness, the heavy crates. It might even explain the unlocked padlock if someone had just been down here recently and forgotten to secure it properly. But even as Wiley tried to rationalize it, some part of him knew that didn't feel right. The footsteps above weren't casual or random. They were deliberate, methodical, moving from room to room like someone was searching for something. Or searching for someone. Wiley backed up until he hit the far wall, keeping his eyes on the ceiling, tracking the footsteps as they moved across the building directly above him. They stopped right over the shelter entrance. Wiley held his breath, watching the stairs, waiting to see if whoever was up there would come down. For a long moment, nothing happened. The footsteps didn't move. The person above was standing right at the shelter entrance, and Wiley was willing to bet they were looking down into the darkness, just like he'd done a few minutes ago. He stood perfectly still, barely breathing, praying that his truck under the covered area wouldn't give away the fact that someone had taken shelter here. The light bulb above him flickered and buzzed, and he resisted the urge to reach up and turn it off. Any movement, any sound, might alert whoever was up there to his presence. Then the footsteps moved again, away from the entrance, back into the building. Wiley let out a slow breath. Maybe they hadn't seen his truck. Maybe they were just checking the building before the storm hit, making sure everything was secure. Maybe he was overreacting, letting his nerves get the better of him. But his instincts, honed by more than 2 decades on the road, told him something different. Those footsteps had been wrong somehow. The rhythm was off, the weight distribution strange. It reminded him of something, but he couldn't quite place what. The storm was still raging above. He could hear it as a distant roar through the concrete, but down here in the shelter, it was eerily quiet. Wiley moved slowly toward the crates again, drawn by curiosity despite his better judgment. He pulled out his pocket knife and worked it under the lid of the top crate, trying to pry it open. The wood was solid, and the nails were driven deep, but he managed to work one corner loose enough to see inside. He angled his flashlight into the gap and peered in. The crate was full of license plates, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all piled on top of each other. Different states, different years, but all of them looked old, scratched, like they'd been removed from vehicles and tossed in here. Wiley felt his stomach drop. There were reasons someone might have a collection of old license plates, legitimate reasons, but none of them explained why they'd be stored in a storm shelter under an abandoned gas station in the middle of nowhere. He thought about the stories he'd heard over the years, stories about people who went missing along these empty highways, about vehicles found abandoned with no explanation. He let the crate lid fall back into place and stepped away, his mind racing. He needed to get out of here. Storm or no storm, he needed to get back to his truck and get the hell away from this place. But even as he started toward the stairs, he heard the footsteps again. Multiple sets now, at least 2 people, maybe 3, moving around in the building above. And they were talking to each other, voices too muffled to make out words, but definitely human voices. Wiley pressed himself against the wall next to the stairs, out of sight from above, and waited. One of the voices got louder, closer, and Wiley could finally make out words. "Saw the truck out front. Somebody's here." It was a man's voice, rough and deep. Another voice responded, this one higher, almost musical, but Wiley couldn't make out what it said. Then the first voice again. "Check the shelter. I'll look in the station." Footsteps approached the shelter entrance, and Wiley knew he was out of time. He reached up and pulled the chain on the light bulb, plunging the shelter into darkness, just as a beam of light appeared at the top of the stairs. Someone was coming down, flashlight beam bouncing off the concrete walls as they descended. Wiley pressed himself into the corner behind the crates, making himself as small as possible, barely breathing. The footsteps on the stairs were slow and careful, and with each step, the flashlight beam swept across more of the room. Wiley could see the shadows it cast, growing larger and more defined as the person descended. He gripped his pocket knife, the blade still open from prying at the crate, and knew it would be useless if it came to a fight. But it was all he had. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. The flashlight beam swept across the room, passing over the crates, moving toward Wiley's corner. He held his breath, pressing back against the concrete, and waited for the inevitable moment when the beam would find him and everything would go to hell. The light moved closer, closer, and then stopped. The person standing at the bottom of the stairs had gone completely still. Wiley could hear them breathing, could almost feel them looking directly at his hiding spot, even though the flashlight hadn't quite reached him yet. Then, from above, the other voice called out, "Anything?" The person at the bottom of the stairs hesitated for just a moment before responding, "No, empty." The flashlight beam swept away from Wiley's corner, moved quickly around the rest of the room, and then the footsteps started back up the stairs. Wiley didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened as the footsteps ascended, as the metal doors at the top of the stairs creaked open and then slammed shut with a bang that echoed down into the shelter. He stayed frozen in that corner for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes, listening to the muffled sounds from above. The voices continued, words still too indistinct to make out, but the tone had changed. There was an urgency now, an edge of frustration or maybe anger. More footsteps, moving faster now, and then the sound of a vehicle starting up. Not his truck, something else, something with a higher-pitched engine. The sound faded away, swallowed by the storm, and then there was silence. Wiley waited another 5 minutes, counted them out in his head, before he finally moved. His legs had gone stiff from holding the same position, and his hand was cramping from gripping the knife so tight. He made his way slowly toward the stairs, stepping carefully to avoid making any noise, and climbed up toward the metal doors. He pushed them open just a crack and peered out into the storm. The rain had lessened somewhat, though the wind was still strong, and he could see his truck still sitting under the covered area where he'd left it. There was no other vehicle in sight. He climbed out of the shelter, scanning the area around the gas station, looking for any sign of the people who'd been here. The building's door was standing open, swinging slightly in the wind, and through the windows he could see a light inside, a faint glow that definitely hadn't been there before. Someone had turned on a light in there, which meant the power worked in the building, too. Wiley moved toward his truck, keeping low, watching the building the whole time. Every instinct told him to just get in the truck and get out of here, but that dead battery meant he wasn't going anywhere. He reached the truck and tried the door. Locked. He'd locked it when he got out, force of habit, and now his keys were sitting in the ignition inside. Wiley closed his eyes and cursed under his breath. Of course, that's how this would go. He looked around for something to break the window with, but before he could find anything, he heard that sound again. Footsteps, coming from inside the gas station building. Someone was still in there, and they were moving toward the door. Wiley ran. He didn't think about it, didn't plan it, just bolted away from the truck and around the back of the building. There was an old service bay back there, the garage door rusted shut, but a regular door next to it that might open. He grabbed the handle and pulled, and the door swung open so easily he almost fell backward. He slipped inside and eased the door closed behind him, then stood there in the darkness, heart hammering, listening. The service bay was pitch black, and it smelled like oil and old rubber. Wiley didn't dare turn on his flashlight, so he stood there with his back against the door, one hand on the handle, waiting to feel if someone tried to open it from outside. He could hear the wind howling through gaps in the building, and rain was leaking through the roof in several places, pattering against the concrete floor. But over all of that, he could hear something else. Breathing. Someone else was in here with him. The breathing was coming from deeper in the bay, beyond where Wiley could see. It was labored and wet, like someone who'd been running hard or maybe someone who was hurt. Wiley's grip tightened on his knife, and he tried to slow his own breathing down, to stay quiet and figure out where exactly the other person was. The breathing continued, steady and rhythmic, and then there was a scraping sound, like something being dragged across concrete. Wiley's eyes were starting to adjust to the darkness, and he could make out shapes now. Tool benches along the walls, a car lift in the center of the bay, and in the far corner, a dark mass that might have been a pile of tarps or equipment. The mass moved. It shifted and rose, and Wiley realized with a jolt of pure terror that it was a person. Someone who'd been lying or sitting in that corner and was now standing up. The figure was tall, had to be over 6 feet, and broad across the shoulders. It stood there for a moment, and Wiley got the distinct impression it was looking directly at him, even though there was no way it could see him in this darkness. Then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come down here." The voice was gravelly and tired, each word seeming to cost effort. "You should have stayed in your truck and waited out the storm like a smart person." There was a pause, and then the breathing got heavier. But you didn't, and now here we are, and I don't know what to do about that. Wiley forced himself to speak, trying to keep his voice steady. I don't want any trouble. I just needed shelter from the storm. My truck died, and I'll be on my way as soon as it starts up again. He was backing toward the door as he spoke, his hand finding the handle behind him. I didn't see anything, don't know anything about whatever it is you've got going on here. Just let me leave, and we'll forget this ever happened. The figure moved closer, and Wiley could see more details now. It was definitely a man, wearing what looked like mechanics' coveralls, and there was something wrong with the way he was moving. One leg dragged slightly, and his left arm hung at an odd angle. When he got close enough that a shaft of light from a crack in the roof illuminated his face, Wiley saw that he was old. Had to be in his 70s at least, with deeply lined features and eyes that were rheumy and red-rimmed. The man stopped about 10 feet away and just looked at Wiley for a long moment. "Name's Tobias Laird," the man finally said. "Toby, if you want to be friendly about it, though I don't suppose you do. This used to be my place, back before it all went to hell, before they came and ruined everything." He gestured vaguely behind him. "I still keep it maintained, after a fashion. Can't quite let it go, you understand. Too many memories in these walls." Wiley nodded slowly, his hand still on the door handle. "I understand, and I'm sorry for intruding, Mr. Laird. Like I said, I just needed shelter from the storm. I'll be on my way now." He started to open the door, but the old man's voice stopped him. "You opened one of the crates." It wasn't a question. "Down in the shelter. You saw what was inside." Toby moved closer, and Wiley could smell him now. A sour smell of old sweat and something else, something chemical. "That means I can't let you leave. You understand that, don't you? I can't let you go out there and tell people what you saw. They'd come back, and I can't have that. I can't let them find what I've been protecting." Wiley's hand tightened on the door handle. "I don't know what you think I saw, but it was just old license plates. I don't care about that. It's none of my business." He pulled the door open a crack, and cold wind rushed in, carrying the smell of rain and ozone. "I'm leaving now, Mr. Laird. Don't make this into something it doesn't need to be." But Toby was moving faster than someone his age should have been able to move, covering the distance between them in 3 long strides. His hand shot out and grabbed Wiley's shoulder, and his grip was like iron, fingers digging in hard enough to hurt. "You don't understand," Toby said, and his voice had taken on a desperate, almost pleading quality. "Those plates aren't just old, they're evidence. They're proof of what they did, what they're still doing. And if you leave here and tell someone about them, they'll come and destroy everything, and all those people will be forgotten forever." Wiley tried to pull away, but Toby's grip was too strong. Up close, he could see that the old man's eyes were wild, pupils dilated, and there was spittle at the corners of his mouth. This wasn't just someone protecting their property. This was someone who'd gone past the edge into something else, something dangerous and unpredictable. "Let go of me," Wiley said, trying to keep his voice calm and authoritative. "Right now. Let go, or I'll defend myself." Toby's other hand came up, the one that had been hanging at the odd angle, and Wiley saw that he was holding something. A wrench, old and heavy and rusted at the edges. The old man raised it slowly, and his face twisted into something that might have been anguish or might have been rage. "I'm sorry," he said. "I really am, but I can't let you leave. I can't let anyone know. Not until I've figured out how to make them all pay for what they did." The wrench came down, and Wiley barely managed to throw himself backward through the door. He landed hard on the wet gravel outside. The breath knocked out of him, and scrambled to his feet as Toby came through the door after him. The old man was still holding the wrench, and the wild look in his eyes had intensified. Wiley backed away, putting distance between them, his boots sliding on the slick ground. The storm had picked up again, and the rain was coming down harder, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in any direction. "Stop!" Wiley shouted, holding up his hands. "Just stop! We can talk about this!" But Toby kept coming, moving with that strange, lurching gait, the wrench held high. Wiley turned and ran, heading for the front of the building where his truck was parked. Maybe he could break into it, find something to defend himself with, or at least put the vehicle between himself and this crazy old man. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked him off his feet, and debris was flying through the air, small pieces of wood and metal that stung when they hit him. He rounded the corner of the building and stopped dead. His truck was still there under the covered area, but it wasn't alone anymore. There was another vehicle parked next to it, a dark SUV with tinted windows, and standing beside the SUV was a figure in a heavy rain jacket, the hood pulled up so their face was hidden. The figure was looking at Wiley's truck, examining it, and they had something in their hand. A flashlight, bright and powerful, the beam cutting through the rain like a blade. Wiley ducked back behind the corner of the building, pressing himself against the wet concrete. Behind him, he could hear Toby still coming, boots crunching on the gravel, labored breathing getting closer. In front of him was someone else, someone who'd arrived in that SUV, and he had no idea who they were or what they wanted. He was trapped between them, and the storm shelter was his only option left. He sprinted for it, cutting across the open space behind the building, expecting to hear a shout or the sound of footsteps pursuing him, but there was only the howl of the wind and the crash of thunder overhead. He reached the shelter entrance and pulled the metal doors open. Not caring any more about the noise, he plunged down the stairs, his boots slipping on the wet concrete, and hit the bottom harder than he'd intended. The light bulb was still off, so he fumbled for his flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam around the room. Everything was the same as it had been, the crates still stacked against the wall, the cot still in the corner. But something felt different. The air was different, charged with more than just the electricity from the storm. It felt like something was about to happen, like the tension before a fight breaks out in a bar. Wiley moved to the crates and started working at the top one again with his knife, prying at the lid. He didn't know what he was looking for, what he thought he'd find that would help him make sense of this nightmare, but he couldn't just stand here waiting for Toby or the person in the SUV to come down those stairs. The lid came loose with a crack of splitting wood, and he pulled it off completely, shining his flashlight inside. The license plates were still there, dozens of them, but now that he was looking more carefully, he could see they weren't random. They were organized, sorted by state, and under each plate was a small plastic bag containing a piece of paper. He pulled out one of the bags and unfolded the paper inside. It was a news clipping, yellowed with age, with a headline that read, "Local Man Missing After Route 270 Trip." There was a photo of a middle-aged man smiling at the camera, and below it, a short article about how he'd left on a routine drive to visit family and never arrived. The license plate in the bag matched the one in the photo, a Kansas plate from '97. Wiley's hands were shaking as he pulled out another bag, then another. Each one was the same. A license plate, a news clipping, a missing person. Different states, different years, but all of them with something in common. They'd all disappeared along this stretch of highway, all vanished without a trace somewhere in the Oklahoma Panhandle. There had to be 50 plates in this crate alone, 50 people who'd gone missing, and there were at least a dozen more crates stacked against the wall. The sound of the metal doors opening at the top of the stairs made him drop the bag he was holding. Footsteps started descending, slow and careful, and a beam of light appeared on the wall. Wiley backed into his corner again, but he knew it was useless. Whoever was coming down would search the room, would find him eventually. He was out of options and out of time. The footsteps reached the bottom and the powerful flashlight beam swept across the room, stopping on the opened crate and the scattered contents around it. A voice spoke. Female this time. Soft but carrying clearly in the enclosed space. "You found them. Good. That makes this easier." The beam moved to find Wiley in his corner, pinning him in place like a moth on a board. "Come on out. We need to talk. We don't have much time. Toby's on his way, and when he gets here, things are going to get complicated." Wiley stepped out slowly, raising one hand to shield his eyes from the flashlight. "Who are you? What is this place?" His voice came out hoarse, strained. "What are all these plates, these people?" The figure lowered the flashlight slightly so it wasn't shining directly in his face, and Wiley could finally see her. She was maybe 50 years old, with short gray hair and a weathered face that suggested she'd spent most of her life outdoors. She was wearing a rain jacket over what looked like a uniform, though Wiley couldn't make out any identifying patches or badges. Her expression was grim, but not hostile, and when she spoke again, there was a sadness in her voice that seemed genuine. "My name is Etta Mae Drummond. I own a diner about 20 miles from here off Route 270. And these," she gestured at the crates, "these are the reason I haven't slept properly in 30 years. These are the people who stopped at my diner, had a meal, got back in their cars, and disappeared before they reached the next town. These are the ghosts that haunt every empty stretch of highway in this God-forsaken part of the world. And Toby, poor bastard that he is, has been collecting their plates and their stories because he thinks it'll somehow bring them justice." She moved closer to Wiley, and he could see now that she looked exhausted, like someone who'd been carrying a terrible weight for far too long. "The question is, what are you going to do now that you've found them? Because there are only two ways this ends for you, friend. Either you help me figure out what happened to all these people, or you become another license plate in another crate." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "And judging by the sounds I'm hearing up there, we're about to have company. So you need to decide right now which way this is going to go." Wiley could hear it too now. Multiple sets of footsteps above, moving around the building. Voices raised in what sounded like an argument. The sound of more vehicles arriving. Whatever was happening, it was getting bigger, more complicated. He looked at Etta Mae, then at the crates full of lost souls, then back at her. "I think," he said slowly, "I think I need to understand what I've stumbled into before I make any decisions. So why don't you start by telling me what you're doing here, and why you're carrying a gun under that rain jacket?" Etta Mae glanced down at her hip, where the jacket had shifted enough to reveal the holster underneath, and smiled grimly. "Smart, man. Yeah, I'm armed. You would be too if you'd seen what I've seen out here. As for what I'm doing here, I'm trying to stop more people from ending up in these crates, and I was hoping Toby could help me do that, but he's gotten worse over the years, paranoid and unpredictable. When I saw your truck, I knew he'd found another visitor, and I couldn't let him do to you what he's done to the others who've stumbled across his collection." "What has he done to them?" Wiley asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Etta Mae's expression darkened. "Let's just say there are more crates down here than you've seen, and not all of them contain license plates. Now come on. We need to get you out of here before this whole situation goes to hell." But it was already too late. The footsteps above had stopped, and in the sudden silence, Wiley heard the unmistakable sound of the metal doors at the top of the stairs opening. Someone was coming down, and from the heavy, uneven footfalls, he knew it was Toby. The old man appeared at the bottom of the stairs, still holding that wrench. His face twisted with rage when he saw Etta May. "You!" he spat. "I should have known you'd show up. Always meddling, always trying to stop me from doing what needs to be done." He took a step toward them, and Wiley saw that his other hand was now holding something else, something that gleamed dully in the flashlight beam. A knife, long and wickedly sharp. "She's lying to you, trucker. She's one of them. One of the ones responsible for all this. She doesn't want to stop it. She wants to cover it up." Etta May moved to put herself between Wiley and Toby, her hand moving to her hip where the gun was holstered. "Toby, put the weapons down. This man hasn't done anything wrong. He's just a trucker who got caught in the storm. Let him go, and we can work this out, just like we always do." But Toby was shaking his head, backing toward the stairs as if he meant to block their exit. "No, not this time. I'm tired of working things out. I'm tired of waiting for someone to listen, for someone to care about all these people who just vanished. It ends tonight. One way or another, it all ends tonight." And then, from the top of the stairs, another voice called down, and this one made Wiley's blood run cold, because he recognized it. It was the same voice he'd heard earlier, the one that had said to check the shelter. The rough, deep voice that had sounded so wrong in that moment. And now that voice was saying, "Everybody stay calm. Nobody needs to get hurt here. We just need to have a conversation about those crates and what's going to happen to them." 3 figures appeared at the top of the stairs and started descending, and as they came into the light, Wiley felt what little hope he'd been clinging to drain away. They were wearing dark clothes and had their faces partially covered with bandanas, and all 3 of them were carrying guns. Not pistols like Etta May's, but serious hardware, rifles and shotguns held with the casual competence of people who knew how to use them. Etta May's hand dropped away from her holster, and she raised both hands slowly, palms out. "Easy now," she said, her voice tight with controlled fear. "Nobody needs to do anything stupid. We can talk about this." The lead figure, the one with the deep voice, reached the bottom of the stairs and swept his weapon across the room, covering all of them. "That's exactly what we're going to do. Talk. About these crates, about who knows what's in them, and about how we're going to make sure this whole situation stays buried just like it has been for the last 30 years. His eyes, visible above the bandana, moved from Toby to Etta May to Wiley. "And then we're going to decide which of you gets to walk out of here and which of you don't." Wiley's mind was racing, trying to understand what he'd stumbled into, trying to see any way out of this concrete tomb that didn't end with him dead. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but down here in the shelter, a different kind of storm was about to break, and he was right in the center of it. The standoff stretched out, nobody moving, everyone waiting to see who would make the first move. And in that frozen moment, Wiley realized with absolute certainty that nothing about this night was going to end well. He'd come down here looking for shelter from a tornado, but what he'd found was something far more dangerous. The question now was whether he'd survive long enough to tell anyone about it. The lead figure took another step into the room, and his finger moved to the trigger of his rifle. "So," he said quietly, "let's start with the trucker. What's your name, friend? And what exactly did you see in these crates?" Wiley opened his mouth to answer, but the words caught in his throat, because in that moment he understood that whatever he said next would determine not just whether he lived or died, but whether the truth about these 50 missing people, these 50 forgotten souls, would ever see the light of day. And he had no idea what the right answer was. Wiley's mouth had gone completely dry, and he was acutely aware of how loud his own heartbeat sounded in his ears. The 3 armed figures had fanned out slightly at the bottom of the stairs, creating a semicircle that effectively cut off any escape route. The lead man, with the deep voice, kept his rifle trained on the center of the room, sweeping it slowly between Wiley, Etta May, and Toby. The other two, flanking him on either side, maintained their positions with the kind of disciplined stillness that suggested military or law enforcement training. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The concrete walls seemed to close in around them, and the single bulb overhead flickered again, casting dancing shadows that made everything feel even more surreal. Wiley had been in tight spots before during his years on the road. He'd had guns pulled on him twice at truck stops, once by a strung-out tweaker trying to steal his cargo, and once by an angry husband who thought Wiley had been flirting with his wife at a diner. He'd talked his way out of both situations by staying calm, speaking slowly, and making it clear he wasn't a threat to anyone. But this was different. These people weren't amateurs or hotheads acting on impulse. They were organized, prepared, and most terrifying of all, they'd come here specifically looking for these crates. They knew what was in them, knew what it meant, and they were willing to kill to keep it quiet. That kind of premeditation was far more dangerous than any strung-out junkie with a shaky trigger finger. The lead man took another step forward, his boots scraping against the concrete floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "I asked you a question, trucker. What's your name?" His voice was patient, but carried an underlying edge that suggested his patience had limits. "And don't think about lying to me. I've already run the plates on your rig up there. I know you're hauling pharmaceuticals out of Tulsa, supposed to be in Amarillo by dawn. Wiley Garrison, 47 years old, clean driving record, married with 2 kids. Did I miss anything?" The fact that they'd already identified him, already knew details about his life, sent a fresh wave of fear through Wiley's body. These weren't random criminals or opportunistic thugs. They had resources, access to databases, the ability to pull up his information in minutes. That suggested connections to law enforcement or government agencies, which somehow made everything worse. At least with criminals, you knew where you stood. But if these were cops or feds or something worse, then the normal rules didn't apply. They could make him disappear just as easily as they'd apparently made 50 other people disappear over the last 30 years. "That's right," Wiley managed to say, forcing his voice to remain steady, even though every instinct was screaming at him to run, to fight, to do anything except stand here like a lamb waiting for slaughter. "I'm Wiley Garrison. I got caught in the storm, needed shelter, found this place, that's all. I don't know anything about these crates or what's in them. I just want to get back to my truck and finish my delivery. I've got a daughter getting married in 6 weeks, and I need that bonus payment to help pay for her wedding. That's the only thing I care about right now." The lead man's eyes, visible above his bandana, studied Wiley for a long moment. "You opened one of the crates," he said, and it wasn't a question. "We saw the pry marks, saw the lid you pulled off. You looked inside, saw the plates, probably saw some of the documentation, too. So don't stand there and tell me you don't know anything. You know enough to be dangerous, which means we have a problem." Etta May shifted slightly, drawing the attention of all 3 rifles immediately. She froze, hands still raised, and spoke carefully. "He doesn't know anything useful. He's been down here maybe 20 minutes, found some old license plates, probably thinks it's just some weird collector's hobby. He doesn't understand what it means, doesn't know about the operation or who's involved. Let him go, and he'll drive away and forget he ever stopped at this place. Truckers see weird stuff all the time on the road. They learn not to ask questions. Is that true, Wiley?" The lead man's attention swung back to him. "You going to drive away and forget about this? Forget about 50 missing people in a shelter full of evidence. Forget about whatever theories are starting to form in that head of yours about what happened to them and who might be responsible." He lowered his rifle slightly, though the other 2 kept theirs trained on the room. Because I don't think you are. I think you're going to get in that truck, drive straight to the nearest police station and tell them everything you saw here, and then we'll have federal agents crawling all over this place within 24 hours, and 30 years of careful work will be undone." Toby, who'd been standing near the stairs with his wrench and knife still in hand, suddenly laughed. It was a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "Careful work? Is that what you call it? Murdering innocent people and covering it up? Making them disappear like they never existed? Leaving families with no answers, no closure, nothing but decades of wondering and hoping?" He took a step forward, and immediately 2 of the rifles swung to point at him. He didn't seem to care. "I know who you are. I've always known. You work for them. For the ones who decided this highway was too inconvenient, too slow, that they needed to push everyone onto the new interstate whether they wanted to go or not. And when people kept using the old road anyway, kept stopping at my station and Etta's diner and the other businesses along here, you made them stop. Permanently." The lead man's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, became more alert, more dangerous. "Toby, you crazy old bastard, you've been telling that story for so long you've started to believe it yourself. Nobody's murdering travelers. These disappearances are just what happens out here in the empty places. People get lost, have accidents, drive off into the desert and die of exposure. It's tragic, but it's not a conspiracy. It's just bad luck and human error." "Then why are you here?" Toby shot back. "Why did you bring armed men to an abandoned gas station in the middle of a tornado if there's nothing to hide? Why do you care so much about a bunch of old license plates that a crazy old man collected?" He was breathing hard now, his face flushed, and Wiley could see his hands trembling as he gripped his weapons tighter. "I'll tell you why, because you know what really happened. You know because you're part of it, because you helped make those people disappear. And you're terrified that someone's finally going to figure it out and expose what you've done." The lead man sighed, a sound of genuine weariness, and raised his rifle again. "Toby, I've tried to be patient with you over the years. We all have. We let you keep your little memorial down here, let you collect your evidence and build your theories because we knew nobody would believe a word you said. Crazy old Toby and his conspiracy theories about missing travelers. But now you've dragged innocent people into it, and that changes things. That makes you a liability we can't afford anymore." Everything happened at once. Toby lunged forward with a roar of rage, raising his wrench like he meant to brain the nearest armed man. Etta May drew her pistol from its holster with surprising speed, swinging it up toward the lead man. The 2 flanking guards opened fire, the sound of the gunshots deafening in the enclosed space. Wiley dropped to the floor on pure instinct, covering his head with his arms as bullets ricocheted off concrete and embedded themselves in wooden crates. He heard Toby scream, heard the wet thud of a body hitting the floor, heard Etta May returning fire with sharp, precise shots that seemed impossibly loud. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving only the ringing in Wiley's ears and the smell of cordite thick in the air. He stayed on the floor, barely breathing, waiting to feel bullets tear into his back. But they never came. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his head and looked around. Toby was on the floor near the stairs, clutching his shoulder where blood was seeping between his fingers. One of the flanking guards was down too, lying motionless with a spreading pool of red beneath him. The lead man and the other guard had taken cover behind the crates, and Etta May had pressed herself against the wall near the cot, her hands empty now, her pistol somewhere on the floor. "Everybody stop!" The lead man's voice cut through the ringing silence. "Stop right now, or I'll put bullets in everyone left standing. Etta, I saw you drop that weapon. Good choice. You got lucky with that shot, but you're outgunned and you know it." His rifle was pointed at her general direction, and the remaining guard had his shotgun aimed the same way. Wiley could see Etta Mae's chest heaving with adrenaline, her eyes wide but focused, calculating her next move even though there didn't seem to be one. The lead man emerged from behind the crates, stepping carefully around the body of his fallen comrade without looking at it. His attention was focused entirely on securing the situation now, making sure nobody else tried anything stupid. "Check Toby," he ordered the remaining guard. "Make sure he's not going to bleed out. We need him alive for now." Then his eyes found Wiley, still on the floor. "And you, get up slowly, hands where I can see them." Wiley climbed to his feet, his legs shaky, his entire body trembling with adrenaline. His ears were still ringing from the gunshots, and when he touched his face, his hand came away with blood. A ricochet or flying concrete chip had opened a cut above his left eyebrow, but it didn't seem serious. He was alive, unhurt beyond a scratch, which was more than he'd expected 30 seconds ago. He kept his hands raised and visible, making no sudden movements, trying to project an image of complete harmlessness. He was just a trucker, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, no threat to anyone. The guard checking Toby called over his shoulder. "Shoulder wound through and through. He'll live if we deal with it soon." Toby was conscious but pale, his teeth clenched against the pain, and the look he gave Wiley was one of apology mixed with resignation. Whatever he'd hoped to accomplish by attacking these men, it clearly hadn't worked out the way he'd planned. The old mechanic had fought back, had tried to do something, and now he was paying for it with blood and pain. "Good," the lead man said, lowering his rifle slightly and pulling down his bandana to reveal a weathered face with sharp features and cold gray eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. "Okay, here's how this is going to work now. Things have escalated beyond what I'd hoped for, but we can still salvage the situation if everyone stays calm and makes smart choices. We're going to have a rational conversation about what happens next, and we're going to come to an agreement that works for everyone involved." He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering on Wiley. The plan was simple. Come down here, confiscate these crates, have a conversation with Toby about letting the past stay buried. But shots have been fired now, and one of my men is dead, so the situation has changed. Etta Mae's voice was tight with barely controlled fury when she spoke. "You're federal agents. You're actually government?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitterness and disgust. "That's somehow worse than I thought it would be. I figured you were hired muscle, corporate security trying to protect some company's liability. But actual federal agents covering up mass murder. That's a special kind of evil." "We're not covering up murder," the lead man said, and he actually sounded offended by the characterization, like he genuinely believed what he was saying. "We're maintaining operational security on a classified project that unfortunately resulted in some civilian casualties during a critical testing phase. There's a significant difference between those two things. What happened on this highway wasn't malicious or intentional. It was necessary for national security, and it was sanctioned at the appropriate levels of government. The families of those people don't need to know the details. They're better off thinking their loved ones just disappeared, just had accidents in an empty part of the country. The truth would only cause more pain and raise questions that can't be answered without compromising active security operations." Wiley found his voice, even though every instinct told him to stay silent and invisible and pray they'd forget he was there. What kind of project kills 50 innocent people and calls it necessary? What could possibly be worth that many lives? He was thinking about his own family now, about his daughter who was supposed to get married in 6 weeks, about his wife who'd be devastated if he never came home from this run. He was thinking about all those license plates in the crates, all those families who'd lived with uncertainty and grief for years, or even decades, never knowing what really happened to the people they loved. The lead man studied him for a long moment, and Wiley got the distinct impression he was making some kind of calculation, weighing options and potential outcomes against each other. The kind of project that keeps this country safe from threats you can't even imagine, he finally said, his voice taking on an almost lecturing tone. The kind that requires testing and development in remote areas where civilian interference needs to be absolutely minimized for both security and safety reasons. Unfortunately, this project coincided with a highway where some people insisted on traveling despite our best efforts to redirect traffic elsewhere. We put up detour signs, we closed rest stops, we even had the state government officially downgrade the road maintenance schedule to encourage people to use the interstate instead. But some people are stubborn. Some people insist on taking the scenic route, on stopping at little out-of-the-way diners and old gas stations, on being exactly where they shouldn't be at exactly the wrong time. Understanding was starting to dawn on Wiley, cold and horrible, spreading through his chest like ice water. You were testing weapons out here, some kind of weapons or chemical agents or God knows what, out in the desert where you thought nobody would notice or care. And when travelers happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, when they saw something they shouldn't have seen or were exposed to something they shouldn't have been exposed to, you made them disappear to cover it up. He looked at the crates again, at all those license plates representing all those destroyed lives and shattered families. 50 people. 50 families torn apart because they were inconvenient to your classified project. 47, actually, the lead man corrected with the precision of someone who'd spent a lot of time thinking about this number. 3 of those disappearances were legitimately unrelated, just regular missing persons cases that happened to occur in the same general area during the same time period. We're not monsters who kill indiscriminately. We don't eliminate people unnecessarily or without serious consideration of the consequences. But when national security is genuinely at stake, when the safety and security of millions of Americans depends on the successful development of certain critical defensive capabilities, then yes, sometimes difficult sacrifices have to be made. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. It's not pleasant, it's not pretty, but it's the reality of keeping a nation safe in a dangerous world. Etta May made a sound of pure contempt, somewhere between a laugh and a snarl. Spare me the philosophical justification and patriotic platitudes. You murdered 47 innocent people to cover up your mistakes and protect your careers, and you've been living with that secret for 30 years. Now you're going to murder 3 more people to keep it quiet for another 30 years. Just admit what you really are, instead of hiding behind national security rhetoric and pretending you're some kind of reluctant hero making hard choices. The lead man's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. I've killed for my country before, Etta. Multiple times, in multiple theaters of operation. I've done things that would give you nightmares, all in service of keeping Americans safe and free. This situation is just one more difficult decision in a very long line of them. One more time when the greater good required actions that most people couldn't stomach or understand. But I'm not unreasonable, and I'm not some cartoon villain who kills without cause or consideration. If there's a way to resolve this situation without additional bloodshed, without adding more names to the list, then I'm genuinely open to finding it. He looked directly at Wiley again, his cold gray eyes boring into him. So here's my offer to you, trucker. You walk away from here tonight, right now, no questions asked. You get in your truck and you drive to Amarillo, and you deliver your pharmaceuticals exactly like you were supposed to. Then you go home to your wife, you walk your daughter down the aisle at her wedding in 6 weeks, and you live a long, happy, comfortable life surrounded by the people you love. All you have to do is forget everything you saw and heard in this shelter tonight. Forget the crates, forget the license plates, forget Toby and Etta, and especially forget me and my team. Pretend this whole night was just a bad dream brought on by the stress of driving through a tornado. Can you do that? Can you walk away and forget? Wiley wanted desperately to say yes. Every fiber of his being, every survival instinct honed over 47 years of life, wanted him to agree immediately, to take the deal without hesitation, to walk away from this nightmare and never look back. He could go home. He could be there for his daughter's wedding. He could grow old with his wife and eventually meet his grandchildren and die peacefully in his own bed, surrounded by family. All he had to do was forget about 47 people he'd never met, forget about their families still waiting for answers that would never come, forget about Toby and Etta, who'd spent years trying to expose this truth. It should have been an easy choice, his life and his family's happiness versus abstract justice for strangers. Most people would take that deal without thinking twice about it. But Wiley knew with absolute certainty that it was a lie, that they'd never actually let him walk away. They couldn't afford to, not after what had happened here tonight, not after their colleague had been killed, not after he'd seen their faces and heard their justifications and admissions. The moment he climbed those stairs and stepped outside, they'd put a bullet in his back and add his license plate to one of those crates with a note about another tragic disappearance during a storm. They'd tell his wife he'd driven off the road in the bad weather, that his body hadn't been recovered yet, but they were still searching. And maybe that would have been acceptable. Maybe he could have made peace with his own death if it was truly unavoidable. But what about Etta May? What about Toby, already wounded and bleeding on this cold concrete floor? Would they kill them too afterward, tie up all the loose ends, ensure this secret stayed buried for another generation? What about them? Wiley asked, nodding toward Etta May and Toby with his chin since his hands were still raised. Do they get the same deal? Do they get to walk away and forget too? He already knew the answer, could read it clearly in the lead man's eyes and the set of his jaw, but he needed to hear it said out loud, needed the truth spoken plainly without euphemisms or justifications. The lead man shook his head slowly, something that might have been genuine regret flickering across his weathered features. They know too much, have known it for too long, and they've been active problems for us for years now. Toby's been documenting all of this obsessively, building his case piece by piece, waiting for someone to finally listen to him. Etta's been helping him, providing information from her diner, connecting dots, encouraging his investigation. They're too invested in exposing what happened here. They can't be trusted to just walk away and stay quiet, not after everything they've done to try to bring this to light. He paused, and that brief flicker of regret appeared again before being suppressed. I'm sorry, I genuinely am. I know that's not what you wanted to hear, and I know it seems unfair. But you're different from them. You're just a trucker who made a wrong turn during a storm, who has no prior connection to any of this, no personal investment in ancient history. You can walk away and forget and move on with your life, and nobody would blame you for making that choice. It's the smart choice, the rational choice, the choice that keeps you alive. And if I can't forget, Wiley heard himself say, surprised by how steady his voice sounded despite the fear coursing through his veins. If I can't just drive away and pretend 47 people didn't die because you and your project couldn't be bothered with basic civilian safety protocols. If I can't abandon 2 people who've dedicated years of their lives to seeking justice for those victims, what happens then? The lead man's expression went completely flat and emotionless, like a mask had slipped into place. Then you join them in the crates, and we tell your wife you disappeared somewhere between here and Amarillo, probably drove off into the desert during the storm in poor visibility. Another tragedy. Another missing trucker. Another family left with questions that will never be answered. Your daughter gets married without her father there to walk her down the aisle. Your wife spends the rest of her life wondering what happened to you, checking her phone every time it rings, hoping for news that never comes. Is that really what you want? Is dying for complete strangers worth destroying your family's happiness and leaving them with that kind of permanent uncertainty and grief? It was a compelling argument, Wiley had to admit. It was exactly the kind of argument that should have worked, that should have broken through his resistance and made him accept the deal being offered. His family's happiness and his own survival versus justice for people he'd never met and never would have known about if not for this storm. Any reasonable person would choose their own family, would prioritize the living over the dead. It was the rational choice, the smart choice, maybe even the moral choice, depending on how you looked at it. But something fundamental had shifted inside Wiley during this long, terrible night in the storm shelter. He'd spent his entire adult life playing it safe, following all the rules, keeping his head down and avoiding trouble. He'd missed countless birthdays and anniversaries and school plays because he was always on the road chasing the next paycheck, always prioritizing financial security over presence and connection. He'd traded time with his family for money, traded being there for providing for them, and he'd always told himself it was the right choice, that he was being a good husband and father by ensuring they had everything they needed materially, even if it meant he was rarely there emotionally or physically. But what kind of man would he truly be if he walked away from this? What kind of father would he be teaching his daughter to become through his example if he chose his own safety and comfort over justice for 47 murdered people? What kind of husband would he be to his wife if he came home carrying the secret that he'd abandoned 2 brave people to die alone while he saved himself? And what kind of life would he actually have, knowing every single day that he'd been complicit in covering up mass murder, that he'd had a chance to do something meaningful and important and right and had chosen cowardice instead? The answer was brutally simple when he let himself see it clearly. He'd be a coward. He'd be complicit in the cover-up, just another person who knew the truth and chose to bury it for personal gain and safety. He didn't think he could live with that knowledge, didn't think he could look at himself in the mirror every morning or look his daughter in the eyes on her wedding day, knowing what he'd done and what he'd failed to do. The guilt and shame would destroy him just as surely as a bullet would, just more slowly and painfully. "No deal," Wiley said, and was genuinely surprised by how calm and steady his voice sounded, even though his heart was hammering so hard he could feel his pulse in his throat. "I'm not walking away from this. Those 47 people deserve better than to be forgotten and erased. They deserve to have their families know what happened to them. Toby and Etta deserve better than to be executed for trying to get justice for those victims. So, if you're going to kill us all, then go ahead and do it. But I'm not going to help you cover up murder by pretending I never saw these crates or heard your confession." The lead man stared at him in what appeared to be genuine surprise, like he'd been completely certain the trucker would take the offer and couldn't quite process this unexpected resistance. "You're making a serious mistake," he finally said, his voice harder now, the last traces of reasonableness evaporating. "A fatal mistake that you won't be able to take back. You think you're being noble and heroic, standing up for principle, but you're really just being stupid and throwing your life away for nothing. Dead heroes don't walk their daughters down the aisle, trucker. Dead heroes don't get to go home to their families and live out their lives. They just get to be dead and forgotten while the world moves on without them." "Maybe so," Wiley agreed, feeling an unexpected sense of calm settling over him now that the decision was made and spoken aloud. "But at least I'll die knowing I did the right thing when it mattered. That I stood up when I could have sat down. That I chose principle over convenience. That's more than you'll ever be able to say, and it's more than I'd be able to say if I took your deal." The fear was still there, still lurking in his gut and making his hands tremble slightly, but it was manageable now, no longer overwhelming. He'd made his choice, chosen his path, and whatever came next, he'd face it with a clear conscience. Etta May was looking at him with something very much like respect and admiration, and even Toby, pale and bleeding and hurting on the cold floor, managed a small nod of approval and solidarity. They understood what he was doing and why, understood the choice he'd made, even though it probably meant they'd all die together in this shelter. At least they wouldn't die alone. At least they'd die standing for something that mattered. The lead man's face had gone hard and cold, all pretense of reasonableness completely abandoned now. He raised his rifle and pointed it directly at Wiley's chest, finger moving to the trigger. "Last chance, trucker. Final offer before this becomes permanent. Walk away right now. Live your life. Forget this happened. Or I pull this trigger and you become number 48 on the list. What's it going to be? You have 3 seconds to decide." Wiley opened his mouth to answer, to make it absolutely clear that he wasn't backing down or changing his mind, when suddenly the lights went out. The single bulb overhead didn't just flicker or fade. It exploded in a violent shower of sparks and glass fragments that rained down on them, plunging the shelter into complete and absolute darkness. Wiley heard the lead man curse viciously, heard rapid movement all around him as everyone tried to orient themselves in the sudden blackness, heard Etta May shouting something he couldn't quite make out over the sound of his own pulse roaring in his ears. Then there was the unmistakable sound of the metal doors at the top of the stairs being thrown open with tremendous force, the crash of metal on concrete echoing through the shelter like a thunderclap or an explosion. Someone else was coming down those stairs, moving fast and purposefully, and they had powerful flashlights that swept across the room in chaotic, intersecting arcs. Wiley threw himself to the side purely on instinct, putting distance between himself and where he'd been standing, and pressed his back against the cold concrete wall. His eyes were struggling desperately to adjust to the darkness after the sudden loss of the overhead light, but all he could see were the dancing, swinging beams from multiple flashlights now, crisscrossing the space as everyone tried to figure out what was happening and who had just arrived. Gunshots rang out almost immediately, the muzzle flashes providing brief, strobing glimpses of frozen moments of chaos like photographs taken in rapid succession. He saw Etta May diving behind the stacked crates for cover, saw the remaining guard swinging his shotgun desperately toward the stairs, saw Toby trying to crawl toward something on the floor with his one good arm. Then another flashlight beam found the lead man, illuminating his face in harsh relief, and Wiley saw his expression of absolute shock and disbelief as he stared up at whoever had just entered the shelter. The lead man's rifle dropped slightly, and he started to form words that never quite made it out of his mouth before another sharp crack of gunfire echoed through the space and he went down hard. The chaos continued for several more seconds that felt like hours. More shots fired from multiple directions. More movement and shouting, more flashlight beams cutting through the darkness trying to find targets. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The gunfire ceased, the flashlight beams steadied instead of sweeping wildly, and an authoritative voice spoke from somewhere near the stairs with calm, professional command. "Weapons on the ground immediately. Everyone still holding hardware has exactly 3 seconds to drop it before I assume hostile intent and respond accordingly. 1, 2. It was a woman's voice, educated and cultured with an accent Wiley couldn't quite place but suggested East Coast upbringing and expensive schools. There was no fear or uncertainty in that voice, only absolute confidence and the clear expectation of immediate compliance. Wiley heard the clatter of weapons hitting concrete, heard boots on the stairs as more people descended, heard more flashlights clicking on until the shelter was almost as bright as it had been with the overhead bulb. In the growing illumination, he could finally see what was happening, and who had just arrived to interrupt the execution that had been about to occur. There were at least 6 new people in the shelter now, all wearing dark tactical gear and body armor, all armed with serious professional-grade weapons held with the casual competence of people who spent their lives training with them. They moved with precise coordination and practiced efficiency, clearing the room methodically and securing everyone who was still conscious and mobile. The lead man was on the floor clutching his leg where he'd been shot, his face twisted in pain and fury and disbelief. The remaining guard was face down on the concrete with his hands behind his head, and someone was efficiently zip-tying his wrists together with plastic restraints. One of the tactical team approached Toby, quickly and expertly assessing his gunshot wound with gloved hands, then spoke into a radio clipped to her shoulder. "Need medical, down here immediately. Gunshot wound to the shoulder, through and through, patient conscious but has lost significant blood. Also need body bags for 2 deceased." She looked up at Wiley, her flashlight sweeping over him briefly. "Anyone else injured?" Her beam found the cut above his eyebrow, where the ricochet or concrete fragment had opened his skin. "That from the shooting?" Wiley shook his head, finding his voice with some difficulty. "Flying debris, I think. Ricochet, maybe. I'm fine, it's just a scratch." He looked around the shelter at the organized, controlled chaos, at the professional soldiers or agents or whatever they were, at the bodies on the floor. "Who are you people? What's happening here? Are you more federal agents?" The woman pulled off her tactical helmet, revealing short-cropped gray hair and a weathered face with intelligent brown eyes that had seen too much of the world's ugliness. She smiled, but it was a tired smile that didn't quite reach those eyes. Something like that. "My name is Special Agent Luella Crane, Federal Bureau of Investigation. My team and I have been investigating the disappearances along this highway for the last 18 months, building a case against corrupt elements within other agencies. We've been tracking the activities of that man and his team for almost as long." She gestured toward the lead man on the floor, who was glaring at her with undisguised hatred. "Turns out some people in the federal government don't particularly appreciate it when rogue operatives decide to cover up their catastrophic mistakes by systematically murdering American civilians. Shocking, I know." Wiley stayed pressed against the concrete wall, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. FBI agents, real ones, not corrupt operatives covering up murders, but actual law enforcement here to investigate and arrest the people responsible. It seemed too good to be true, like something from a movie rather than real life, and part of him kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for this to turn into another nightmare twist. But the agents moved with professional efficiency that was impossible to fake, securing the scene and treating Toby's wound with genuine medical expertise. The lead man and his remaining guard were both in restraints now, being read their rights in clear official tones that left no room for doubt about what was happening. Luella Crane moved toward the stacked crates, her flashlight sweeping over them with evident interest and something that looked like satisfaction. She pulled out one of the plastic bags containing a license plate and news clipping, examining it carefully in the light. "Toby's documentation is actually what finally broke this case wide open for us," she said, almost conversationally, as if discussing something mundane rather than evidence of mass murder. "He's been sending copies of his findings to various federal agencies for years, maybe a decade or more. Most of them got dismissed as conspiracy theories from a disturbed individual, filed away and forgotten. But I work in a specialized division that investigates governmental misconduct and internal corruption, and when I started seriously cross-referencing his claims with classified project records and incident reports, some very disturbing patterns emerged that couldn't be explained away as coincidence or paranoia." She held up the bag, the license plate clearly visible through the plastic. 47 people. All disappeared within a 5-mile radius of a classified testing site for experimental electromagnetic weapons and related technologies. All during the exact same 3-year window when active field testing was being conducted in this area. All dismissed by the original investigators as unrelated missing persons cases, just tragic coincidences in a remote area where people sometimes get lost or have accidents. But when you map them out chronologically and geographically, the pattern is undeniable. They all disappeared on days when testing was scheduled. They all vanished along this specific stretch of highway that runs directly adjacent to the testing ground, and not a single one of them was ever found, which is statistically almost impossible even in a place this empty and vast. Wiley felt his legs starting to shake with delayed reaction now that the immediate danger seemed to have passed. He slowly lowered his hands and leaned back against the wall for support, trying to process everything he'd just lived through and everything he was hearing now. "So Toby was right all along," he said, his voice coming out hoarse and strained. "About the project, about the weapons testing, about people being killed to cover it up. He spent years trying to expose this, and everyone thought he was crazy, but he was actually right the whole time." Luella nodded, her expression grim. "Completely right, unfortunately." The project was called Sentinel Shield, a Defense Department initiative to develop directed energy weapons and electromagnetic countermeasures. The testing was approved for this remote area because it was supposed to be minimally populated, just empty desert and abandoned roads that nobody used anymore since the interstate went in. But they made a critical miscalculation. Some people still use these old highways, still stopped at places like Toby's gas station and Etta's diner. Truckers taking scenic routes or avoiding way stations. Tourists looking for authentic experiences off the beaten path. Locals who'd been driving these roads their whole lives and saw no reason to change. And when those people were in the wrong place at the wrong time during field testing, the results were catastrophic. She paused, and medical personnel were arriving now, making their way carefully down the stairs with equipment and a stretcher. They went immediately to Toby, who was looking increasingly pale and weak from blood loss. One of them started an IV while another worked on properly bandaging the shoulder wound. The old mechanic's eyes found Wiley's across the room, and despite his obvious pain and exhaustion, he managed a small smile of what looked like vindication and relief. Someone had finally listened. Someone had finally believed him. After all these years of being dismissed as a crazy conspiracy theorist, the truth was finally coming out. Luella continued as the medics worked. The electromagnetic pulses and directed energy beams didn't just disable electronics or create interference like they were supposed to in controlled conditions. When they interacted with moving vehicles and their occupants in real-world scenarios, the effects were far more severe and unpredictable than the models had predicted. Some people lost control of their vehicles when all electronics failed simultaneously at highway speeds. Some were exposed to dangerous levels of electromagnetic radiation that caused immediate medical emergencies. Some simply disappeared, their vehicles found abandoned with no sign of the drivers or passengers, and we still don't fully understand what happened to them or where they ended up. The lead man, still on the floor with a gunshot wound in his leg, being tended to by another medic, laughed bitterly at that. "You don't understand because you weren't there, because you didn't see what those weapons could do when they achieved full power during certain atmospheric conditions. The field effects weren't just electromagnetic interference. They created localized spatial distortions, temporary holes in reality itself. Some of those people didn't die in any conventional sense. They were displaced, torn out of normal space-time and deposited God knows where. We couldn't find their bodies because there were no bodies to find. They just ceased to exist in any meaningful way." Luella's expression hardened as she looked at him. And instead of shutting down the program immediately when you realized it was killing civilians, instead of reporting the casualties and trying to locate survivors or remains, you covered it up. You made it look like routine disappearances. You collected the license plates and documentation to keep track of your victims, but you never told their families what really happened. You let them suffer with uncertainty for decades, rather than face consequences for your catastrophic failure. "We had our orders," the lead man said, and there was no remorse in his voice, only bitter defensiveness. The project was deemed critical to national security. The technology, once properly refined and controlled, could revolutionize modern warfare and defense systems. The higher-ups decided that some acceptable losses during development were preferable to abandoning research that could save millions of American lives in future conflicts. We were told to maintain operational security at all costs, to ensure testing could continue without public interference or political pressure to shut it down prematurely. Etta May, who'd been standing quietly near the crates since the shooting stopped, made a sound of pure disgust. "Acceptable losses. That's what you call 47 murdered people. Acceptable losses." She moved toward him, and one of the FBI agents stepped in to gently prevent her from getting too close. "I knew some of those people. They stopped at my diner, had coffee and pie, told me about their lives and their families. They were real people with real lives, not just casualties in your classified project. And you took them away from their families without a second thought, without any remorse or guilt, just filed them away as acceptable losses and moved on with your research." "War requires sacrifice," the lead man said flatly. "That's an ugly truth that civilians never want to face. Every major technological advancement in military history has been purchased with blood and suffering. The atomic bomb, jet engines, radar systems, stealth technology, all of it came at tremendous human cost. This project was no different. We were developing capabilities that could protect millions of Americans from foreign threats. Some people died during that development. That's tragic, but it doesn't change the fact that the work was necessary and important." Wiley felt anger rising in his chest, hot and fierce, burning away the last remnants of fear and shock. He pushed off from the wall and moved toward the lead man, stopping only when Luella held up a warning hand. "Those people weren't soldiers who volunteered to take risks for their country," he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "They were civilians going about their normal lives on a public highway. They didn't consent to be test subjects for your weapon. They didn't sacrifice themselves willingly for the greater good. You killed them, and then you covered it up. And now you're trying to justify it with patriotic rhetoric about national security and necessary sacrifices. But there's nothing patriotic about murdering innocent people to hide your mistakes." The lead man met his eyes, and for the first time, Wiley saw something other than cold calculation or defensive anger in that gaze. There was something that might have been guilt or shame, buried deep but visible if you knew to look for it. "You think I don't know that?" he said quietly. "You think I haven't spent 30 years living with what we did, knowing what we took from those families? I'm not a monster trucker. I'm just a man who followed his orders and did what he was told was necessary, and now I have to live with the consequences of those choices. You'll never understand what it's like to carry that weight, to know that you've done terrible things for supposedly good reasons and have no way to make it right." "Then you should have refused the orders," Wiley shot back. "You should have blown the whistle, exposed what was happening, forced them to shut it down. Instead, you became complicit in murder and spent decades covering it up. So don't expect sympathy or understanding from me. You made your choices, and now you get to face justice for them." Luella stepped between them, effectively ending the confrontation. "He's right," she said, looking at the lead man. "You'll face justice now, real justice in a court of law, everyone involved in this cover-up, everyone who gave orders or followed them or helped hide the evidence, they're all going to be held accountable. This ends tonight. No more secrets, no more cover-ups, no more acceptable losses. She turned to Wiley. And you, trucker, you helped make that possible. If you'd taken their offer and walked away, if you'd chosen your own safety over doing what was right, we might not have gotten here in time. Toby and Etta would be dead, the crates would have been destroyed, and this whole thing would have stayed buried for another generation. The medics had Toby stabilized now, and were preparing to move him up to the ambulance that had presumably arrived while Wiley was focused on the confrontation. The old mechanic looked up at Wiley as they lifted the stretcher. "Thank you," he said, his voice weak but clear. "Thank you for not abandoning us. Thank you for standing up when you could have walked away. Those 47 people finally get justice because of you." Wiley nodded, not trusting himself to speak past the lump in his throat. He watched as they carried Toby up the stairs and out into the night. More agents were coming down now, evidence technicians with cameras and collection equipment, beginning the process of documenting everything in the shelter. The crates would be carefully cataloged, every license plate and piece of documentation preserved as evidence for the trials that would follow. The families would finally get answers, finally know what had happened to their loved ones, even if those answers brought more pain than comfort. Luella was giving instructions to her team, coordinating the scene processing and prisoner transport with the efficient competence of someone who'd done this many times before. When she finished, she turned back to Wiley. "Your truck is up top, and we've had our technical people look at it while we were securing the perimeter. There was a remote kill switch installed on your battery, probably placed there by advanced scouts to trap anyone who stopped at this location. It's been removed and disabled now. The engine should start normally, and you're free to go whenever you're ready. You'll need to provide a detailed statement at some point, probably tomorrow after you've had a chance to rest and process everything. And you'll almost certainly have to testify when this goes to trial, which could be months or even years from now. But for tonight, you can finish your delivery and go home." Wiley looked around the shelter one more time, at the crates full of lost souls, at the evidence of decades of cover-up and murder, at the agents working to document it all. "What happens now?" he asked. "To all of this, to the families, to the people responsible." Luella's expression was grim but determined. "Now comes the hard part. We'll have to notify 47 families that their loved ones are officially confirmed dead, that they were killed by their own government during a weapons test gone catastrophically wrong. We'll have to explain that the uncertainty they've lived with for years or decades was caused by an intentional cover-up, that people knew what happened and chose to hide it rather than face consequences. That's going to destroy some of those families all over again. And there's nothing we can do to soften that blow or make it easier. The truth is brutal and ugly, and it's going to cause a lot of pain." She paused, looking at the crates. "But at least they'll know. At least they'll be able to bury their dead properly, literally or figuratively. At least they'll understand that their loved ones didn't just abandon them or decide to disappear, that there's a concrete reason and specific people to hold accountable. That's not much comfort, but it's something. And the people responsible will face justice. They'll be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and if I have anything to say about it, they'll spend the rest of their lives in federal prison thinking about the lives they destroyed." Wiley absorbed that, trying to imagine what it would be like to be one of those families, to get a phone call or a visit from the FBI after all these years of not knowing. Would it bring closure or just open old wounds? Would they be grateful for the truth or angry that it took so long to come out? He supposed it would be different for each family, each person processing the information in their own way. But at least they'd have the truth. At least they'd know. "I should go," he said finally. I've got pharmaceuticals that need to get to Amarillo, and I'm already hours behind schedule. I'll probably lose my bonus payment, but I guess that doesn't seem as important as it did a few hours ago." He managed a weak smile. Funny how nearly dying puts things in perspective. Luella smiled back, and this time it did reach her eyes. "Go ahead, drive safe. And Wiley?" She waited until he met her gaze. "You did good tonight. You stood up when most people would have backed down, chose principle over self-preservation, refused to be complicit in a cover-up, even when it would have been easier and safer to walk away. The world needs more people like you, people willing to do the right thing even when it costs them something. Don't forget that when the nightmares come, when you're lying awake at 3 in the morning, replaying everything that happened here, you made the right choice, and 47 families are going to get closure because of it." Wiley nodded, feeling emotion threatening to overwhelm him. He turned and started up the stairs before he could break down completely. Behind him, he could hear the agents continuing their work, the click of cameras and the rustle of evidence bags, the low murmur of professional conversations. The concrete walls seemed less oppressive now, less like a tomb and more like what they really were. Just a storm shelter that had become an impromptu evidence locker for one of the ugliest secrets in recent American history. He emerged into the cool night air and stopped, taking several deep breaths to clear his lungs of the smell of cordite and blood and fear that had filled the shelter. The storm had completely passed while all this was happening, and the sky was clearing rapidly, stars becoming visible between the breaking clouds. His truck sat exactly where he'd left it under the covered area, looking solid and ordinary and comfortingly familiar. There were FBI vehicles parked all around the gas station, lights flashing blue and red, and agents moving purposefully between them. But the scene had the feeling of a situation under control, a crisis being professionally managed rather than chaos spiraling out of hand. Wiley walked to his truck, climbed into the familiar cab, and sat there for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel. He could see his reflection in the rearview mirror, and he looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last few hours. There was dried blood on his face from the cut above his eyebrow. His clothes were dirty and torn, and his eyes had a haunted look that he'd seen before in the eyes of other truckers who'd been through traumatic experiences on the road. He'd have to clean himself up before he got to Amarillo, would have to come up with some explanation for why he looked like he'd been in a fight and why his delivery was so late. But that could wait. For now, he just needed to drive, to put this place behind him and get back to the familiar rhythm of the road. He turned the key, and the engine started immediately, running smooth and strong just like Luella had promised. He put the truck in gear and pulled out onto the highway, heading west toward Amarillo and home, and a future that would forever be divided into before and after this night. The first rays of dawn were touching the eastern horizon as he drove, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Wiley had been on the road for almost 24 hours now, far longer than was safe or legal, but he was wide awake and alert, his system flooded with adrenaline and the after-effects of extreme stress. Sleep would come eventually, probably crashing over him like a wave once the adrenaline wore off, but not yet. For now, he was content to drive and watch the sunrise and think about everything that had happened. His phone rang about 30 miles down the road, and he saw it was his wife calling. He'd forgotten that he was supposed to check in with her hours ago, forgotten that she'd been worried and trying to reach him while he was fighting for his life in that underground shelter. He answered it, putting it on speaker so he could keep both hands on the wheel. "Hey, honey, I'm sorry I didn't call sooner. I got caught in that storm. Had to take shelter for a while, lost track of time. I'm okay, though. I'm fine." Her voice was tight with worry and relief. "Wiley, I've been calling you for hours. I was starting to think something terrible had happened. Are you sure you're okay? You sound strange, like something's wrong." He wanted to tell her everything, wanted to pour out the whole story of the shelter and the crates and the confrontation and the shooting. But he knew he couldn't. Not yet. Not while he was driving and not before he'd had a chance to process it himself. "I'm just tired," he said, which was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. "It's been a really long night, but I'm okay, I promise. I'll be home tomorrow, and we can talk then. I have a lot to tell you." They talked for a few more minutes, just the mundane conversation of a long married couple, and it helped ground him, reminded him of why he'd made the choice he'd made. He had a life to get back to, a family that loved him, a daughter getting married in 6 weeks. He could have lost all of that tonight if things had gone differently, if the FBI hadn't arrived when they did, if he'd made different choices at critical moments. But he hadn't lost it. He was still here, still alive, still driving toward the future. After he hung up with his wife, he drove in silence for a while, watching the landscape gradually change as he left the Oklahoma Panhandle behind and crossed into the Texas Panhandle. The sun was fully up now, bright and warm, burning away the last traces of the storm. The road was empty in both directions, just Wiley and his truck and the endless highway stretching out to the horizon. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost surreal after the intensity of the last few hours. He thought about Toby in his hospital bed, probably in surgery by now, finally able to rest knowing that his years of obsessive documentation hadn't been in vain. He thought about Etta May, probably giving her own statement to FBI agents, relieved that the truth was finally coming out, but grieving for the 47 people whose deaths had been hidden for so long. He thought about the families who would soon get devastating phone calls, families who would have to process information that was both closure and fresh trauma. And he thought about the choice he'd made when offered a chance to walk away and forget. It had seemed like an impossible decision in the moment, choosing between his own life and abstract justice for strangers. But now, driving away from that place with the knowledge that he'd done the right thing, he realized it hadn't really been a choice at all. Not for him, not with the kind of person he was or wanted to be. He couldn't have walked away and lived with himself. He would have carried that guilt and shame for the rest of his life, would have been destroyed by it just as surely as a bullet would have destroyed him. So he'd stood up, had refused the easy way out, had chosen to do the right thing even when it was terrifying and dangerous. And somehow, miraculously, he'd survived to tell the tale. That felt like a gift, like a second chance at life that he hadn't quite earned but had been given anyway. He didn't plan to waste it. He'd go home, hug his wife, help his daughter with her wedding plans, and try to be more present and engaged with his family instead of always being on the road chasing the next paycheck. Life was too short and too precious to spend it all behind the wheel of a truck, missing the moments that really mattered. The miles rolled by, marked by road signs and distant landmarks. Wiley made good time now that he was clear of the storm and the crisis, pushing the truck a little faster than he probably should, but not caring much about speed limits or regulations anymore. He had pharmaceuticals to deliver, a bonus to hopefully salvage despite his massive delay, and a family waiting for him at home. The normal concerns of his trucking life were reasserting themselves, pushing the nightmare of the shelter into the background where it would eventually become a memory rather than an immediate traumatic experience. But he knew he'd never forget that night. He'd never forget the crates full of license plates and lost lives, never forget Toby's desperate attempt to expose the truth, never forget the choice he'd made when offered an easy way out. It would stay with him forever, a turning point in his life that divided everything into before and after. Before, he'd been a man who played it safe, who avoided trouble, who chose security and comfort over risk and principle. After, he was someone different. Someone who'd stood up when it mattered. Someone who'd chosen courage over cowardice. He didn't know yet what that meant for the rest of his life, how it would change him or the choices he'd make going forward. But he suspected it was going to be significant, that he'd crossed some invisible line in that shelter and couldn't go back to being the person he'd been before. Maybe that was okay. Maybe he'd been needing to change for a long time, needing to become someone his daughter could be proud of rather than just someone who provided financial support from a distance. The sun climbed higher in the sky as he drove, burning off the last traces of the storm and the night's darkness. Ahead, the road stretched out toward Amarillo and home, and whatever came next. Behind, an abandoned gas station in the Oklahoma Panhandle was being transformed into a crime scene, a place where terrible secrets had been hidden for 30 years but were finally being brought to light. Wiley Garrison, long-haul trucker and ordinary man who'd made an extraordinary choice, drove on toward the future. He still had miles to go before he slept. Wiley delivered the pharmaceuticals to Amarillo just after 9 in the morning. 6 hours behind schedule, but still within the acceptable window for refrigerated goods. The warehouse manager took one look at him, at the dried blood on his face and his disheveled appearance, and asked if he needed medical attention. Wiley declined, said he'd been caught in the storm and had taken some minor injuries from flying debris, nothing serious. The manager didn't press the issue, just processed the delivery and sent him on his way. No bonus payment, but at least no penalty either. Under the circumstances, Wiley considered that a win. He found a truck stop on the outskirts of Amarillo and pulled in, parking in the back lot where he could get a few hours of sleep before making the long drive home. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in that shelter, seeing the crates full of license plates, hearing the gunshots echoing off concrete walls, feeling the cold certainty that he was about to die. His hands shook when he tried to hold his coffee cup, and the breakfast he ordered at the truck stop diner sat untouched on the table while he stared at it and tried to convince his stomach to accept food. The other truckers in the diner looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and recognition. They'd all been there at some point, had all had runs that went sideways in unexpected and traumatic ways. A few nodded at him in silent acknowledgement, the kind of understanding that didn't require words or explanations. One older driver, a heavy-set man with a gray beard and kind eyes, stopped by his table on the way out and set a hand briefly on Wiley's shoulder. "Whatever happened out there," he said quietly, "you made it through. That's what matters. Give yourself time to process it, and don't try to just push through and pretend you're fine. Trust me on that." Wiley nodded his thanks, and the man left. He sat there for another hour, nursing cold coffee and watching the sun climb higher in the morning sky. Finally, he gave up on sleep and called the FBI field office in Oklahoma City, asking for Special Agent Luella Crane. He was transferred twice before reaching her, and when she answered, she sounded tired but alert. "Mr. Garrison, I was expecting your call. How are you holding up?" "I don't know," Wiley admitted, and was surprised by how honest that felt. "I keep thinking about it, about what could have happened if you hadn't shown up when you did. I keep seeing those license plates and thinking about all those families. I can't seem to stop my hands from shaking, and I haven't been able to sleep. Is that normal?" Luella's voice was gentle but direct. "Completely normal. You experienced a significant trauma, multiple traumas really, over the course of a few hours. You were held at gunpoint, witnessed violence, believed you were about to be executed, and were exposed to information about serial murder and governmental cover-up. That's not something you just shrug off and move past immediately. I'd recommend talking to a counselor or therapist who specializes in trauma. The Bureau can provide referrals if you need them." Wiley absorbed that, staring at his reflection in the diner window. He looked older, worn down, like someone who'd aged a decade overnight. "What happened after I left? To Toby and Etta Mae? To the people you arrested?" Toby came through surgery fine. He's stable and expected to make a full recovery. Etta's giving her official statement right now, and she'll probably be tied up with us for most of the day going through everything she knows. As for the people we arrested, they're all in federal custody facing multiple charges including murder, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and abuse of authority. The lead agent you spoke with, his name is actually irrelevant at this point, but he's already trying to negotiate a plea deal in exchange for testimony against his superiors. It won't help him much. The evidence is overwhelming, and the publicity around this case is going to make it politically impossible to offer any kind of lenient treatment. She paused, and Wiley heard papers rustling in the background. The real work starts now, though. We have to notify 47 families, conduct 47 death investigations, and build prosecutorial cases against everyone involved in the cover-up. That's going to take months, maybe years, and you're going to be part of it, whether you want to be or not. Your testimony will be crucial in establishing the events of last night, the admissions made by the perpetrators, the condition of the evidence. Are you prepared for that? Wiley thought about his daughter's wedding in 6 weeks, about his normal life that he'd been so eager to get back to just hours ago. That life seemed impossibly distant now, like something from a dream or a previous existence. I don't have a choice, do I? Those families deserve justice, and if my testimony helps make that happen, then I have to do it, even if it means reliving this night over and over in depositions and courtrooms. You always have a choice, Luella corrected. You could refuse to testify, could claim trauma, or invoke various protections. It would weaken our case significantly, but we'd still have enough physical evidence to prosecute. So don't feel like you're trapped or obligated. This has to be your decision, made freely, understanding what it will cost you personally. But Wiley already knew what his decision would be. He'd made it back in that shelter when he'd refused to walk away, when he'd chosen principle over self-preservation. I'll testify. Whatever you need from me, whenever you need it. Those people deserve that much. Thank you, Luella said, and she sounded genuinely grateful. I'll be in touch soon to schedule a formal statement. For now, go home. Be with your family. Try to find some normalcy while you can, because once this goes public, your life is going to get complicated. The media will want to interview you. The defense attorneys will try to discredit you, and you'll become a central figure in one of the biggest governmental misconduct cases in recent history. That's not an easy burden to carry. They said their goodbyes, and Wiley sat in the diner booth for a while longer, processing that conversation and what it meant for his future. He'd thought surviving the night was the hard part, but now he realized that was just the beginning. The real challenge would be living with what he'd learned, carrying the knowledge of those 47 deaths, standing up in court and facing down the people who'd tried to kill him. It would take months or years, would consume huge chunks of his life, would probably cost him sleep and peace of mind, and maybe even relationships if people got tired of his trauma and his obsession with the case. But it had to be done. Those families needed closure, and justice needed to be served, and he was one of the few people who could make that happen. So he'd do it, would carry that burden and pay that cost, because the alternative was unthinkable. He couldn't go back to his old life pretending none of this had happened, couldn't look his daughter in the eye at her wedding knowing he'd walked away from the chance to give 47 families the truth they deserved. He finally left the diner and climbed back into his truck, pointing it toward home and the long drive ahead. The highway was busy now with morning traffic, other truckers and commuters and travelers all going about their normal lives with no idea what had happened in that storm shelter last night. Wiley envied them their ignorance, their ability to move through the world without carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. But he also pitied them slightly, because they'd never be tested the way he'd been tested, never have to make the kind of choice he'd made, never know what they were truly capable of when pushed to their limits. The miles passed slowly, marked by familiar landmarks and rest stops. Wiley stopped twice for coffee and bathroom breaks, and both times he found himself studying the other people at the truck stops and gas stations, wondering if any of them were carrying their own terrible secrets, their own burdens of knowledge that changed how they saw the world. Probably most of them were just normal people living normal lives, but maybe a few had stories like his, moments when they'd stumbled into something dark and had to choose whether to look away or stand up. He tried calling his wife again around noon, but she didn't answer. Probably at work or out running errands. He left a message saying he was on his way home and should be there by evening, that he loved her and couldn't wait to see her. He didn't mention anything about the storm shelter or the FBI or the choice he'd made. That conversation would have to happen face to face, in their living room where he could hold her hand and explain everything properly. The afternoon sun was brutal, beating down on the truck's cab and making him squint even with sunglasses on. Wiley turned on the radio, trying to find something to distract him from his thoughts, but everything seemed trivial and meaningless compared to what he'd experienced. Music felt hollow, talk radio felt idiotic, and news programs seemed to be deliberately avoiding the story that mattered most. Of course, the story hadn't broken yet. The FBI would need time to notify families and coordinate with prosecutors before going public. But soon, probably within days, it would be everywhere. And then his life would never be the same. He was about 2 hours from home when his phone rang. Unknown number, but he answered it anyway, thinking it might be Luella or another FBI agent following up. Instead, it was a male voice he didn't recognize, cultured and professional. "Mr. Garrison, my name is not important, but I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." Wiley felt his stomach drop, ice water flooding his veins. "Who is this? How did you get this number?" "Those questions are irrelevant," the voice continued smoothly. "What's relevant is that you've become involved in something much larger and more complicated than you understand. The people arrested last night are small fish, mid-level operatives following orders from much higher up the chain. The real architects of that project are still out there, still in positions of power, and they're very concerned about the attention this case is going to receive." Wiley's hands tightened on the steering wheel, and he felt the familiar fear from last night creeping back in. "Are you threatening me? Because if you are, you should know the FBI is already aware of everything. Threatening me won't help cover this up." The voice laughed, not unkindly. "I'm not threatening you, Mr. Garrison. I'm warning you. There's a difference. The people I represent have no interest in harming you or your family. That would only create more problems and draw more attention. But they are very interested in how this case proceeds, in what information becomes public and what remains classified for national security reasons. Your testimony will be crucial in determining that outcome." "So, what do you want from me?" Wiley asked, already knowing he wasn't going to like the answer. "Nothing right now. This is simply an introduction, an acknowledgement that we know who you are and what you've done. Consider it a reminder that the story you think you understand is incomplete, that there are layers and complications you haven't been told about. When the time comes for you to testify, when you're sitting in a courtroom deciding how much detail to provide and which questions to answer fully, remember this conversation. Remember that some truths are dangerous not because they're lies, but because they're too true, because they expose things that need to remain hidden for the safety and security of millions of people." Wiley felt anger rising through his fear. "You're asking me to lie in court, to help cover up the murder of 47 people. I'm asking you to think carefully about the consequences of your choices," the voice corrected. "The people who were killed, that's tragic and regrettable. But they're already dead. Nothing you do or say will bring them back. Their families will get closure regardless of how much detail you provide in your testimony. The question is whether you want to be responsible for compromising ongoing national security operations, for exposing classified technologies that hostile nations would love to learn about, for potentially causing international incidents that could destabilize global politics. Those are the stakes we're really dealing with here. Those are the same justifications the people who killed them used, Wiley shot back. National security, greater good, acceptable losses. I've heard it all before, and I didn't buy it then. I'm not buying it now from you either. The voice sighed. I expected as much. You're principled, committed to your moral stance. That's admirable in its way, even if it's ultimately foolish. But consider this, Mr. Garrison. You have a daughter getting married in 6 weeks. You have a wife who loves you. You have a life you want to get back to. Are you really willing to risk all of that, to make yourself a permanent target and a permanent problem, just to provide slightly more detail in a courtroom? The people responsible will be punished regardless. The families will get their closure regardless. The only variable is how much you complicate your own life and potentially endanger the people you love. Wiley was gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles were white. Don't you dare bring my family into this. Don't you dare threaten them. No threats, Mr. Garrison. Just observations about reality. You're about to become a very public figure in a very controversial case. That brings attention, scrutiny, and unfortunately risks. We'd prefer to minimize those risks for everyone involved. Think about it. We'll be in touch. The line went dead. Wiley immediately called Luella, hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. She answered on the second ring. What's wrong? What's wrong? He told her about the call, repeating the conversation as accurately as he could remember it. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end. God damn it, Luella finally said. They work fast. I'd hoped we'd have more time before the political pressure started. Who are they? Wiley demanded. Who was that? Probably someone from the Defense Department or the intelligence community. Someone with a vested interest in keeping certain details classified. The project that caused those deaths wasn't just some isolated experiment. It was part of a much larger research initiative that's still ongoing in other forms. They're worried that your testimony and the public trial will expose technologies and methodologies that they consider classified. They'll do everything they can to minimize the damage, which includes pressuring witnesses and shaping the narrative. Wiley felt sick. So they can just call me up and try to intimidate me, and there's nothing you can do about it? I didn't say that. Give me the number that called you. We'll trace it, investigate it, and if we can prove direct witness intimidation, we'll add more charges to the pile. But you need to understand something, Wiley. This case is going to get political fast. There will be pressure from above to limit the scope of the investigation, to classify certain evidence, to negotiate plea deals that protect higher-level officials. I'm going to fight that every step of the way, but I can't guarantee success. The system is complicated, and powerful people have ways of protecting themselves. So what do I do? Wiley asked, feeling helpless and overwhelmed. How do I protect my family from people like that? You tell the truth in court, provide your testimony honestly and completely, and trust that the system will work the way it's supposed to, and you let us worry about protecting you and your family. We can provide security, monitor for threats, intervene if anyone tries to intimidate you further. You're not alone in this. But I won't lie to you, it's going to be difficult. The next few months are going to test you in ways you probably can't imagine yet. They talked for a few more minutes, Luella giving him instructions on documenting any future contact attempts and providing a direct number he could use to reach her any time. When they hung up, Wiley felt marginally better, but still deeply unsettled. He'd thought surviving the night was the hard part. Then he'd thought testifying would be the hard part. But now he was realizing that the real challenge was going to be living with being a target for people who had vast resources and few scruples about using them. He drove on through the afternoon, hyper-aware now of every vehicle that seemed to follow him too long, every rest stop where someone looked at him twice, every shadow that felt wrong. Paranoia was creeping in, the normal trucker's awareness of his surroundings morphing into something darker and more suspicious. He hated it, hated feeling this way, hated that a single phone call could transform the entire experience of being on the road. The sun was setting when he finally pulled into his driveway, the familiar sight of his house almost bringing him to tears with relief. He'd made it home. He was alive. His family was safe, at least for now. He climbed out of the truck on shaky legs and stood there for a moment, just breathing and trying to center himself before going inside. His wife met him at the door, and one look at his face told her something was seriously wrong. "Wiley, what happened? You look terrible." She pulled him inside, leading him to the couch, sitting next to him with her hands gripping his. "Talk to me. What's going on?" And so he told her everything. The storm shelter, the crates, the confrontation, the shooting, the FBI raid, the phone call from the anonymous voice. It poured out of him in a torrent, all the fear and trauma and anger and confusion of the last 24 hours. She listened without interrupting, her face growing increasingly pale and worried as the story unfolded. When he finally finished, she was crying. "Oh, God, Wiley, you could have been killed. You almost were killed." She pulled him into a tight embrace, and he felt her shaking. "Why didn't you just take the deal they offered? Why didn't you walk away when you had the chance?" "I couldn't," he said simply. "I couldn't live with myself if I'd done that. Those people deserved better. Toby and Etta Mae deserved better. I had to stand up." She pulled back, looking at him with a mixture of love and frustration and fear. "And now what? Now we're targets? Now our family is in danger because you decided to be a hero?" "I wasn't trying to be a hero," Wiley protested. "I was just trying to do the right thing. And Luella said they'd protect us, that we'd have FBI support if anything happened." "FBI support," his wife repeated bitterly. "That's supposed to make me feel better? Wiley, our daughter's getting married in 6 weeks. Are we supposed to have FBI agents at the wedding, watching for threats? Are we supposed to live looking over our shoulders for the rest of our lives?" "I don't know," Wiley admitted. "I don't know what happens next or how bad it's going to get, but I know I made the right choice back in that shelter. I know that if I'd walked away, I wouldn't be the man you married, the man our daughter thinks I am. I'd be a coward who valued his own safety over justice for innocent victims." They argued about it for another hour, going in circles, her fear and anger clashing with his conviction that he'd done the right thing. Eventually, they reached an exhausted truce, agreeing to disagree but still together, still committed to facing whatever came next as a family. She made him dinner, which he barely touched. She ran him a bath where he sat in hot water until it turned cold, trying to wash away the memories of concrete and blood and fear. Later that night, lying in bed next to his wife, Wiley found himself unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in that shelter. Every small sound made him tense, wondering if it was someone coming for him. The anonymous phone call had gotten into his head, planting seeds of paranoia that were already starting to grow. Around 2 in the morning, he gave up on sleep and went to sit in his living room staring out the window at the quiet suburban street. Everything looked normal, peaceful, safe. But he knew that was an illusion now. Underneath the veneer of normalcy there was darkness and danger, and people willing to kill to protect their secrets. He'd pulled back the curtain and seen what was really there, and he could never unsee it. His daughter called the next morning, excited about some detail of the wedding planning. Wiley listened to her chatter about flowers and seating arrangements and tried to match her enthusiasm, tried to be the normal father she expected, but his mind kept drifting to the phone call, to the implicit threat against his family, to the knowledge that his choice in that shelter might have put the people he loved most in danger. When his daughter asked if something was wrong, if he was okay, Wiley lied and said he was just tired from the long drive. She accepted that, continuing her monologue about the wedding. And Wiley listened, committing every detail to memory, because he wasn't sure anymore how many more normal conversations like this he'd get to have with her before everything changed. The next few days passed in a strange limbo. Wiley stayed home, unable to face going back out on the road yet. He jumped at unexpected sounds, checked the locks on doors and windows obsessively, watched every car that drove past his house. His wife noticed, but didn't comment, just stayed close and tried to provide comfort through her presence. Luella called twice to check in and provide updates on the case, but there was nothing concrete yet, just bureaucratic procedures and legal maneuvering. On the fourth day, the story broke. Someone leaked it to the press, probably deliberately, and suddenly it was everywhere. 47 missing persons cases linked to secret government weapons program. Federal agents arrested in decades-long cover-up. Trucker's testimony key to exposing government misconduct. Wiley's name was in the articles, his face on the news. His phone started ringing constantly with reporters wanting interviews, producers wanting him for talk shows, lawyers offering to represent him. He unplugged the house phone and turned off his cell. But he couldn't unplug the doorbell, and journalists started showing up at his house, knocking on his door, leaving business cards. His wife stopped going to work because photographers were camped out in their driveway. His daughter called, crying, because reporters had tracked her down and were asking intrusive questions about her father and whether she was afraid he'd be killed for testifying. The FBI provided protection after the third day. Unmarked cars parked outside their house. Agents rotating through shifts. It helped, but it also made everything feel more real and more dangerous. They wouldn't need protection if there wasn't a genuine threat. And knowing there was a threat, knowing people might actually try to hurt him or his family to keep him quiet, that was worse than any nightmare. Wiley tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible. Everything had changed. His quiet life as a long-haul trucker was over, replaced by this new existence as a witness in a major federal case, a target for people with resources and reach, and no qualms about eliminating problems. He couldn't go back to the road even if he'd wanted to. His company had quietly suggested he take extended leave, probably worried about the liability of having such a controversial figure on their payroll. 2 weeks after the story broke, Wiley was sitting in his living room when he saw it. A dark sedan parked across the street too far for him to see who was inside, but close enough to make his skin crawl. It wasn't the FBI protection detail, he knew their vehicles. This was something else. He watched it for 30 minutes, and it didn't move, didn't leave. Just sat there, idling, watching his house. He called Luella, and she said she'd send someone to check it out. But by the time the FBI car arrived, the sedan was gone. Disappeared as quickly and mysteriously as it had appeared. The agents searched the area but found nothing. No witnesses, no surveillance footage, no evidence it had ever been there except Wiley's word. Maybe he'd imagined it, they suggested gently. Maybe the stress was getting to him, making him see threats that weren't really there. But Wiley knew what he'd seen. Someone had been watching his house, watching his family. Whether they were from the Defense Department or intelligence community or somewhere else entirely, he didn't know. But they wanted him to know they were there, wanted him to feel watched and vulnerable and afraid. And it was working. He was terrified, not for himself, but for his wife and daughter, for the innocent people who might pay the price for his decision to stand up in that shelter. His daughter's wedding was in 3 weeks now, and Wiley wasn't sure he'd be able to enjoy it. Wasn't sure he could walk her down the aisle without looking over his shoulder for threats. The happiest day of her life, and he was going to spend it paranoid and jumpy and afraid. That felt like a betrayal, like he was stealing joy from her because of choices he'd made. Late one night, unable to sleep again, Wiley sat at his kitchen table and wrote a letter to his daughter. He explained everything that had happened, why he'd made the choices he'd made, what he'd hoped to accomplish. He told her he loved her more than anything, that every moment on the road away from her had been torture, that walking her down the aisle was going to be the proudest moment of his life. He told her that if anything happened to him, if the worst came to pass, she should know he'd died standing for something that mattered, and that was more than most people could say. He sealed the letter in an envelope and put it in his sock drawer, hoping he'd never need it, but wanting it there just in case. Then he went back to bed and lay there in the dark, listening to his wife breathe and wondering how much longer they'd have this peace before it was shattered by violence or tragedy, or whatever came next. The phone call came 3 days before the wedding. Same unknown number. Same cultured voice. "Hello again, Mr. Garrison. I trust you've been paying attention to recent events." Wiley's blood ran cold. "What do you want?" "Just checking in. Seeing if your position has evolved at all given the current circumstances. You've experienced firsthand how complicated your life has become. Imagine how much simpler it could be if you cooperated with us, if you limited your testimony to the bare minimum necessary and avoided discussing classified aspects of the project." "I'm telling the truth in court," Wiley said firmly. "All of it. Whatever you do to me or my family, that won't change." The voice sighed. "You're remarkably stubborn, Mr. Garrison. Most people would have backed down by now, would have accepted that they're outmatched and outmaneuvered. But not you. You keep pushing forward, keep choosing the hard road. I actually admire that, even as I find it frustrating." "Is that all?" Wiley asked. "Because if you're not going to threaten me with anything new, I'm hanging up." "One last thing," the voice said, and now there was an edge to it, something harder and colder. "The wedding is in 3 days. Beautiful venue, I understand. Your daughter must be so excited. It would be a shame if anything disrupted that day, if some unfortunate incident cast a shadow over what should be a joyous occasion. I'm sure you'd hate for her memories of her wedding day to be tainted by tragedy or fear." Wiley felt rage exploding in his chest. "You stay away from my daughter. You stay away from my family. Whatever you want from me, you deal with me directly. You don't touch them." "We're not going to touch anyone, Mr. Garrison. That's the point. We're simply observing, noting, making sure you understand the full scope of what's at stake. Your cooperation or lack thereof has consequences that extend beyond just yourself. Remember that." The line went dead again. Wiley immediately called Luella, hands shaking with anger and fear. "They just threatened my daughter's wedding. They all but promised something would happen if I don't cooperate." Luella was silent for a moment. "We'll increase security for the wedding. Plainclothes agents, surveillance, the full package. And I'm going to escalate this to my superiors, push for charges of witness intimidation and threatening a federal witness. But Wiley, you need to understand something. These people operate in gray areas. They'll never make an explicit threat we can prove. They'll just create circumstances that feel threatening, that make you afraid without ever crossing the line into prosecutable territory. So they can just terrorize my family, and there's nothing you can do about it." I didn't say that. We're doing everything we can, but you have to be realistic about the limitations of what we can protect you from. These aren't street criminals or organized crime. These are people with institutional backing and sophisticated methods. The best protection you have is to stay strong, maintain your commitment to testifying truthfully, and trust that exposure and publicity will deter them from doing anything that would draw more attention to the case. Wiley wanted to believe that, but he wasn't sure he did. The dark sedan, the phone calls, the implicit threats, they all suggested people who weren't particularly deterred by publicity or consequences. They operated with the confidence of individuals who believed themselves above the law, protected by classification and national security and layers of bureaucratic insulation. The wedding day arrived. Wiley woke before dawn, checking the locks and looking out the windows for any sign of the dark sedan or other threats. The FBI protection detail was in place, additional agents brought in for the event. Everything should have been safe. But Wiley couldn't shake the feeling of impending disaster, couldn't convince himself that his daughter's special day wasn't about to be ruined by his choices. The ceremony was beautiful. His daughter looked radiant in her wedding dress, glowing with happiness. Wiley walked her down the aisle, fighting back tears, trying to be present in the moment even as part of his mind was scanning the crowd for threats. The vows were exchanged, the rings placed, the kiss shared, and nothing happened. No disruption, no incident, no tragedy, just a normal, beautiful wedding. But at the reception, during the father-daughter dance, Wiley saw him. A man in a dark suit standing at the edge of the venue, not a guest, but not staff either, just watching. Their eyes met across the room, and the man smiled slightly, nodded once, then turned and walked away. Wiley almost broke away from the dance to go after him, but his daughter was in his arms, laughing and happy, and he couldn't bring himself to ruin her moment. When the dance ended and he went to look for the man, he was gone. Wiley told the FBI agents who searched the venue but found no one matching the description. Maybe he'd imagined it, they suggested. Maybe the stress and fear were making him see threats everywhere. But Wiley knew what he'd seen. Someone had been there, watching, reminding him that they could reach into his life any time they wanted, could appear at his daughter's wedding just to prove they had access. The message was clear. You think you're safe, but you're not. You think we can't touch you, but we can. Anytime, anywhere we can find you and your family. Remember that when you're on the witness stand deciding how much to say. Wiley stood on the edge of the dance floor, watching his daughter and her new husband share their first dance as a married couple, and felt a cold certainty settling over him. This wasn't over. It would never be over. He'd made his choice in that storm shelter, had chosen principle over safety, and now he was going to pay for that choice for the rest of his life. So was his family, whether they'd chosen it or not. He thought about the 47 people in those crates, about the families who'd lived with uncertainty for decades. At least they'd get closure now, would finally know what happened to their loved ones. That was worth something. That had to be worth the price Wiley was paying. But as he stood there watching his daughter laugh and dance, as he felt the weight of invisible eyes watching him from unknown locations, as he contemplated the testimony he'd have to give in coming months and the target that would remain on his back for years, or maybe forever, Wiley found himself wondering if he'd truly understood what he was sacrificing when he refused to walk away. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, filled with threats he couldn't anticipate and dangers he couldn't avoid. He'd wanted to be someone his daughter could be proud of, someone who stood up for what was right. But at what cost? And when would that cost be fully paid? The music played on, the celebration continued, and Wiley smiled and danced and acted like everything was fine. But inside, he was calculating, planning, wondering how he was going to protect his family from enemies who existed in shadows and operated beyond the reach of normal law. He'd survived the storm shelter, had survived the confrontation and the shooting and the FBI raid. But survival, he was learning, was just the beginning of a much longer and more complicated nightmare, one that might not have an ending at all. The truck sat in his driveway, unused for weeks now, gathering dust. Wiley looked at it through the window and wondered if he'd ever drive again, ever get back on the road and feel that freedom he used to take for granted. Probably not. That life was over, killed in a storm shelter in the Oklahoma Panhandle along with his innocence and his peace of mind. He'd made his choice. Now he'd have to live with it. However long that life might be, and whatever it might cost him before the end finally came. The storm rolled across the Kansas flatlands like God's own hammer, turning the afternoon sky the color of old bruises and sending sheet lightning dancing across the horizon in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Elmer Dade had been driving trucks for 31 years, and he'd seen his share of prairie storms, but this one felt different somehow. Wrong. The air pressure had been dropping for the last hour, making his ears pop and his sinuses ache, and the temperature had plummeted 20 degrees in the span of 15 minutes. The radio had been spitting nothing but static and fragmented weather warnings for the last 30 miles, and his CB had gone completely dead about 10 minutes ago, just cutting out mid-transmission from another trucker and never coming back. He was hauling agricultural equipment from Wichita to a distribution center outside Hayes, a route he'd driven dozens of times over the years. Normally, it was an easy run, straight highway through empty farmland, nothing to worry about except maybe hitting a deer or getting stuck behind a slow-moving tractor. But today the road felt hostile, the landscape around him seeming to close in despite the vast openness of the plains. The wheat fields on either side of the highway were being whipped by wind so fierce it created visible waves in the grain, and he could see debris tumbling across the distant fields like the world itself was coming apart at the seams. The rain started without warning, going from nothing to deluge in the space of a single breath. 1 second, Elmer could see the road clearly ahead of him. The next, his windshield was a solid wall of water that his wipers couldn't even begin to clear. He had to slow down to a crawl, leaning forward in his seat and squinting through the downpour, trying to make out the white line at the edge of the highway that would keep him from drifting off into the ditch. Visibility dropped to maybe 10 feet, then 5, then almost nothing. The rain was coming down so hard it actually hurt when it hit the truck's roof, a constant, thunderous drumming that made it impossible to hear anything else. Lightning struck somewhere close enough that Elmer saw the bolt clearly through his windshield, a jagged fork of pure white light that seemed to split the world in half. The thunder that followed was immediate and deafening, making his fillings ache and his heart skip a beat. He'd been through storms before, had even been caught in a few tornadoes over the years, but something about this felt genuinely dangerous in a way that transcended normal weather concerns. This felt malevolent, personal, like the storm was actively trying to kill him rather than just being a natural phenomenon he happened to be caught in. His headlights did almost nothing in the deluge, the beams just reflecting back off the sheets of water and creating a disorienting wall of white light. Elmer kept his speed down to maybe 20 miles per hour, both hands gripping the wheel tight enough to make his knuckles ache, and tried not to think about how exposed he was out here on this empty highway with no shelter in sight. The radio was still spitting static, occasionally resolving into fragments of what might have been voices or might have been his imagination, too brief and distorted to make out any actual words. That's when he saw the road sign, barely visible through the rain, announcing the town of Meridian Falls, population 847, next exit 2 miles. Elmer knew the name vaguely, one of those small Kansas towns that existed primarily as a dot on a map and a place for truckers to fuel up or grab a quick meal. He'd probably stopped there once or twice over the years, though he couldn't recall any specific details. But right now, it represented shelter, a chance to get off the road and wait out the worst of the storm in relative safety. He kept his eyes fixed on the right side of the highway, watching for the exit ramp. The exit appeared out of the rain like something from a dream, and Elmer took it carefully, feeling his trailer sway slightly in the fierce wind. The off-ramp curved down and connected to a smaller two-lane road that presumably led into town. The rain was still coming down in biblical proportions, and the road was already starting to flood, water pooling in the low spots and creating hazards he had to navigate carefully. His truck pushed through a particularly deep section, water splashing up over his hood, and for a heart-stopping moment he thought he might stall out. But the engine kept running, and he made it through to slightly higher ground. The town appeared gradually through the curtains of rain, low buildings, and scattered streetlights that seemed too dim to be functioning properly. Elmer drove slowly down what appeared to be the main street, looking for a gas station or truck stop or anywhere he could pull in and wait out the storm. But something was wrong with the town, something his brain registered before he could consciously identify it. The streetlights were on. He could see their weak amber glow, but there were no other lights visible anywhere. No businesses with illuminated signs, no houses with lights in the windows, no traffic signals or vehicle headlights, just those dim streetlights and otherwise complete darkness, despite the early afternoon hour made darker by the storm. He passed what looked like a grocery store, then a diner, then a gas station, all with their lights off and no vehicles in the parking lots. Every building looked closed, abandoned even, though they didn't appear particularly old or run down, just empty. Elmer felt unease starting to build in his chest. That instinctive sense that something was very wrong here, even if he couldn't articulate exactly what. Where was everyone? Even in a bad storm, even with people sheltering in place, you'd expect to see some signs of life. Lights in houses, a few vehicles, something. But Meridian Falls looked like a ghost town, evacuated and abandoned. The street dead-ended at what appeared to be the town square, a small park with a gazebo and some benches, all being battered by the rain and wind. Elmer pulled his truck into the parking area adjacent to the park and killed the engine, sitting there in the darkness and trying to figure out what to do next. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Lightning was striking all around now so frequently that the world seemed to exist in a constant state of flickering illumination, darkness and brilliant light alternating in rapid succession. The thunder was continuous, less individual claps, and more a sustained roar like being inside a waterfall. He tried his CB radio again, flipping it on and adjusting the channel selector through all 19 channels. Nothing but static on every frequency, not even a hint of another transmission. Same with his phone, no signal at all despite the tower icon showing full bars earlier. The storm must be disrupting everything, or maybe Meridian Falls was just too small and remote to have good coverage. Either way, Elmer was effectively cut off from any outside communication. He was alone, in an apparently abandoned town in the middle of a supernatural-feeling storm, and every instinct he had was screaming at him to get back on the highway and keep driving no matter how bad the conditions were. But that would be stupid. Visibility was essentially zero. The roads were flooding, and lightning was striking close enough to be a genuine danger. Driving in these conditions would be suicidal, and Elmer hadn't survived 3 decades on the road by making reckless decisions when scared. He needed to stay put, wait out the worst of the storm, and then get back on the highway and finish his delivery. The town being empty was weird, sure, but there was probably a rational explanation. Maybe there'd been some kind of evacuation order he hadn't heard about. Everyone told to leave because of flooding or tornado warnings or some other emergency. That would explain the abandoned feel, the lack of people or vehicles or lights. He was just starting to relax slightly, starting to convince himself that everything was fine and he was just spooked by the storm's intensity when he saw the figure. It was standing at the edge of the park, barely visible through the rain. Just a dark shape that might have been a person or might have been a trick of the light in his overactive imagination. Elmer squinted, trying to get a better look, and the figure moved. Definitely a person, walking toward his truck with what seemed like deliberate purpose despite the storm raging around them. Elmer's hand went instinctively to the door lock, making sure it was engaged. The figure got closer, and he could make out more details now. A man, wearing what looked like a rain slicker and wide-brimmed hat, moving with the steady confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going and wasn't bothered by the deluge. When he got within about 20 feet of the truck, he stopped and looked up at Elmer's cab. Lightning flashed, and Elmer got a clear look at his face. It was an older man, maybe 60 or 70, with a weathered face and sharp eyes that seemed to glow slightly in the reflected light. The man made a gesture, pointing toward one of the buildings on the edge of the square, then made a motion like he was speaking into something, holding his hand to his ear. A radio, Elmer realized. The man was pointing toward a building and indicating that he had a radio or wanted to use a radio. Maybe he was the sheriff or some other local official who'd stayed behind during the evacuation. Maybe he could provide information about what was happening in Meridian Falls and when it would be safe to leave. Elmer hesitated for a long moment, every instinct still screaming at him not to leave the relative safety of his cab. But he couldn't just sit here forever, and if this man could help him understand what was going on, that was valuable information. He grabbed his rain jacket from behind the seat, pulled it on, and opened the door. The wind immediately tried to rip it out of his hands, and the rain hit him like a physical blow, cold and hard and relentless. He jumped down from the cab and immediately sank ankle-deep in water that was pooling across the parking area. The man in the rain slicker turned and started walking toward the building he'd pointed at earlier, and Elmer followed, struggling against the wind and trying not to lose his footing in the rushing water. The building turned out to be some kind of municipal structure, brick construction with a sign that was too rain-soaked to read. The man opened a heavy wooden door and stepped inside, and Elmer followed him into darkness. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust. They were in what appeared to be the lobby of a small government building, with a reception desk and some chairs and official-looking notices posted on bulletin boards. Everything was dark except for the faint light coming through the windows, the lightning outside providing a regular illumination. The man was already moving deeper into the building, and Elmer hurried to keep up, not wanting to be left behind in the darkness. They went through a door marked Sheriff's Office and into a back room that contained a desk, some filing cabinets, and most importantly, a radio setup that looked considerably more sophisticated than anything a small-town sheriff would normally have. The equipment was old but well-maintained. Big console radios with glowing vacuum tubes and multiple frequency dials. The man flipped a switch, and one of the radios hummed to life, its tubes casting a warm amber glow in the darkness. "Name's Vernon Huxley," the man said, his voice rough and deep. "Sheriff of Meridian Falls, or what's left of it. You picked a hell of a day to come through here, trucker." He started adjusting dials on the radio, and the speaker crackled with static. "Radio's been acting up since the storm hit, but it still works better than anything else. Cell towers are down, CB frequencies are dead, but this old girl can usually punch through if you know what you're doing." Elmer found his voice. "What happened here? Where is everyone? The whole town looks abandoned." Vernon didn't look up from the radio, just kept adjusting dials and listening to the static. "Evacuation order came through about 6 hours ago. Flash flood warning, severe storm cells, possible tornadoes. They told everyone to head to Hayes or Russell, get to higher ground and proper shelter. I stayed behind to coordinate with emergency services, make sure everyone got out safe." He paused, and something that might have been a smile crossed his weathered face. Or maybe I stayed because I'm too damn stubborn and old to leave my town just because some weatherman says it might rain hard. You're here alone? Elmer asked, and couldn't keep the disbelief out of his voice. In an evacuated town during a storm this bad? Not alone anymore, Vernon pointed out. You're here too, and probably shouldn't be. Highway should have been closed. Barricades should have stopped anyone from exiting into town, but I guess the storm took out the barriers. Or maybe they never put them up properly in the first place. Either way, you're stuck here now same as me until this blows over. The radio suddenly crackled with something that wasn't quite static. A voice or voices speaking in overlapping fragments that Elmer couldn't make out clearly. Vernon leaned closer to the speaker, his expression intense and focused. "There we go," he muttered. "Come on, sweetheart, talk to me. Let me hear you." He adjusted another dial, and the voice became slightly clearer, though still distorted and broken up by interference. "Anyone receiving? Meridian Falls, emergency broadcast. If anyone..." Vernon grabbed the microphone. "This is Sheriff Vernon Huxley in Meridian Falls. I read you, whoever you are. Can you clarify your transmission?" He released the button and waited, but only static came through. He tried again. "Meridian Falls here. Reading you on..." "What frequency is this?" He checked the dial. "Reading you on 155.475. Please identify and clarify your message." More static, and then the voice came through again, clearer this time. Female, youngish, with a hint of panic underneath the professional tone. "Clara Jean Pickett, emergency operator for Ellis County. Sheriff Huxley, is that really you? We've been trying to reach Meridian Falls for hours. We thought the whole town was evacuated." Vernon glanced at Elmer, and something passed between them. Some shared recognition that this conversation wasn't going to bring good news. "It is evacuated, Clara Jean. Just me here and one lost trucker who had the bad luck to take shelter in town. What's your emergency broadcast about?" The pause before she answered seemed to stretch out forever, filled with crackling static and distant thunder. "Sheriff, you need to leave Meridian Falls immediately. The flood situation is worse than predicted. Beaver Creek is over its banks and rising fast, and it's going to cut through town in less than an hour. Maybe less. You need to get to high ground right now, preferably get out of town completely if you can." Elmer felt his stomach drop. He'd been worried about the rain and lightning, but flooding hadn't even crossed his mind. Kansas could flood. He knew that intellectually, but out here on the high plains it seemed almost impossible. "How bad are we talking?" Vernon shade-assed into the microphone, his voice still calm, but with an edge of concern now. "Bad enough that we're evacuating everyone within 5 miles of the creek. The water's moving fast, carrying debris, taking out power lines and bridges. If you're in a low-lying area, you need to move now. If you're in town proper, you might have a little more time, but not much. Get to the highest point you can find and stay there until we can get rescue services to you. Do you understand, Sheriff?" Vernon looked at Elmer. Highest point in Meridian Falls is the water tower on the north edge of town. 3-story structure, stairs to the top, platform with a railing. We could ride this out there if we had to. "Or we could get back on the highway and drive out of here," Elmer suggested, trying to keep his voice level. "My truck can handle some water, and if we leave now, we might beat the worst of it." Vernon shook his head. "Highway runs right alongside Beaver Creek for about 2 miles east of here. If the creek's flooded, like Clara Jean says, the highway will be underwater or washed out completely. We'd be driving straight into the flood." He keyed the microphone again. "Clara Jean, what's the status of Highway 283 east of town? Is it still passable?" Static filled the room, and for a long moment Elmer thought they'd lost the connection. Then Clara Jean's voice came back, fainter now, harder to make out. Reports of washouts, at least 3 sections completely. Vehicle swept off the road near mile marker. Recommend you do not attempt to leave town via highway. Repeat, do not attempt highway evacuation. Find high ground and shelter in place. Emergency services will reach you as soon as conditions allow. Understood, Vernon said. But before he could say anything else, the radio emitted a sharp squeal of feedback and then went dead. He tried adjusting the dials, tried switching frequencies, but nothing worked. The tubes were still glowing. The equipment was still powered on, but no signal was coming through on any channel. Just dead air. Not even static. Elmer and Vernon looked at each other in the flickering, lightning-illuminated darkness. Water tower, Vernon said. It's our best option. Higher than any building in town, sturdy construction, far enough from the creek that it shouldn't be at risk from the initial flood. We get up there, we wait it out, and we're still alive when rescue shows up. What about my truck? Elmer asked, thinking about his cargo and his livelihood and the expensive equipment he was hauling. I can't just abandon it to get washed away. Better your truck than your life, Vernon said flatly. Equipment's insured, right? Your life isn't. The water tower's about 6 blocks north of here, maybe a 10-minute walk in normal conditions. In this storm, with flooding already starting, it'll take longer and be dangerous. But it's doable if we move now. You make your choice, trucker. Come with me to high ground, or stay here and hope your vehicle has enough protection when several feet of fast-moving water comes through. Put like that, there wasn't really a choice at all. Elmer nodded. Lead the way, Sheriff. They went back through the dark building and out into the storm, which had somehow gotten even worse while they were inside. The rain was a solid wall now, and the water in the streets was visibly higher, rushing past in currents that tugged at Elmer's boots when he stepped into it. Vernon produced a flashlight from somewhere and used it to illuminate their path, though the beam didn't penetrate very far through the downpour. They walked north through the abandoned town, past dark buildings and empty parking lots, and with each block, Elmer could feel the water getting deeper and the current getting stronger. The sound of the flood reached them before they could see it, a low roar that cut through even the thunder and rain. Vernon's flashlight beam found water ahead, a wall of it coming down the street from the direction of the creek, carrying debris and moving fast. "Move!" Vernon shouted, grabbing Elmer's arm and pulling him toward a side street that seemed to still be clear. They splashed through ankle-deep water that rapidly became knee-deep, fighting the current and the wind and the rain, both men gasping for breath and struggling to stay on their feet. The water tower appeared out of the darkness like a salvation, a tall, cylindrical structure with Meridian Falls painted on its side in faded letters. A metal staircase spiraled up the outside, and Vernon led the way, taking the steps 2 at a time despite his age. Elmer followed, his boots slipping on the wet metal, his hands numb from cold and fear as he gripped the railing. Behind them, he could hear the roar of the flood getting louder, closer, and he didn't dare look back to see how close it really was. They reached the platform at the top of the tower, just as the main surge of the flood hit the base below them. Elmer looked down and immediately wished he hadn't. The water was everywhere now, filling the streets and swirling around buildings, carrying cars and debris and what might have been parts of houses. The entire town was disappearing beneath muddy brown water that moved with terrifying speed and power. His truck would be gone, he realized. Everything would be gone. Meridian Falls was drowning, and he and Vernon were perched on top of a water tower watching it happen. Vernon was trying his radio again, a handheld unit he'd brought from the office, but it was as dead as the console radio had been. No signal, no voices, no response to his calls. They were cut off, isolated on their tiny platform high above the flood, with nothing to do but wait and hope the water didn't rise high enough to reach them. The storm raged on, lightning striking so close Elmer could smell ozone, thunder shaking the metal tower beneath their feet. Hours passed, marked only by the slowly changing angle of the weak light filtering through the storm clouds. The flood peaked and then gradually began to recede, the water level dropping inch by inch as the rain finally started to let up. By the time darkness fell properly, not just storm darkness but actual night, the water had dropped enough that Elmer could see the tops of cars and the roofs of single-story buildings emerging from the muddy brown surface. Vernon was silent for most of this, just standing at the railing and watching his town drown. Finally, as full darkness settled and the rain reduced to a drizzle, he spoke. "Meridian Falls has been here since 1887. Survived droughts and dust bowls and tornadoes and every damn thing the plains could throw at it. Never thought I'd see it go out like this, washed away in a single afternoon." He looked at Elmer. "You picked one hell of a day to drive through Kansas, trucker." Elmer couldn't argue with that. He was cold and wet and exhausted, his hands shaking from adrenaline and his mind still trying to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. His truck was gone, his cargo was gone, and he was stranded on top of a water tower in a flooded town with no communication and no idea when help would arrive. If this was what survival felt like, he wasn't sure it was much better than the alternative. But at least he was alive, that was something. The night stretched out ahead of them, long and dark and cold, and somewhere in the distance beyond the flooded wreckage of Meridian Falls, the storm finally began to break. The night on the water tower was the longest of Elmer's life. The temperature dropped steadily as the hours passed, and despite his rain jacket, he was soaked through and shivering uncontrollably. Vernon seemed less affected by the cold, or maybe he was just better at hiding it, standing at the railing and staring down at the flooded town below with an expression that might have been grief or might have been simple exhaustion. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? The town was underwater, their communications were dead, and they were stuck on this platform until rescue arrived or the water receded enough for them to climb down safely. Around midnight, Vernon's handheld radio crackled to life without warning. Both men jumped at the sudden sound, and Vernon fumbled for the device, nearly dropping it in his haste. The static resolved into a voice, female and clear, though the signal quality was poor and fading in and out. "Meridian Falls. Anyone receiving? This is Clara Jean Pickett. Emergency Services. Can anyone hear me?" Vernon grabbed the transmit button. "Clara Jean, this is Sheriff Huxley. We read you. We're on the water tower north of Town Square. Both of us are safe, but stuck until the water goes down. What's the status of rescue operations?" He released the button and waited, but only static came back. He tried again. "Clara Jean, do you copy? We need to know when help is coming." The radio crackled, and Clara Jean's voice came through again, but something was off about it. The tone was different, flatter, almost mechanical despite being clearly human. "Water tower, yes, we see you there. Stay where you are. Help is coming. Just stay on the tower and wait. Don't try to leave." Elmer felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. There was something wrong with that transmission. Something he couldn't quite identify, but that set all his instincts screaming. Vernon seemed to feel it too, because he was staring at the radio with a frown, his weathered face creased with concentration and confusion. "Clara Jean, can you give us an ETA on rescue and confirm your location? Are you still in Ellis County Dispatch?" Static filled the air for a long moment, and then the voice came back. It sounded more like Clara Jean now, more natural, though still with that odd, flat quality underneath. "Still at dispatch. Working coordinates. Rescue team is preparing. Should reach you by dawn, maybe sooner if weather improves. Just stay put, Sheriff. Don't try to come down until we arrive." "Understood," Vernon said, but his expression suggested he didn't understand at all, that something about this conversation was deeply wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. "We'll wait for rescue. Clara Jean, one more thing. Can you confirm how you're reaching us? Our handheld shouldn't have this kind of range, and the atmospheric conditions should be making radio communication nearly impossible." The pause before she answered stretched out uncomfortably long. When the voice finally came back, it was different again, more hurried, with genuine emotion bleeding through. "Sheriff, if you can hear this, something's wrong with the comm systems. Messages are being, I don't know, distorted or delayed, or just be careful. Don't trust everything you hear on the radio. I'm trying to reach you, but I don't know if..." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by dead silence. Not even static this time, just nothing. Vernon tried to call back, but the radio was completely dead again, not even powering on when he pressed the button. He shook it, checked the battery, tried everything he could think of, but it was simply not working anymore. He set it down on the platform with a heavy sigh. "That was wrong," Elmer said, breaking the silence. "Both transmissions. Something about them felt wrong, like it wasn't really her, or like someone was feeding her lines, or..." He trailed off, not sure how to explain the visceral wrongness he'd felt listening to those messages. Vernon nodded slowly. Radio's been acting strange since the storm hit. More than just interference or atmospheric conditions. Signals coming in on frequencies that should be dead, voices that sound almost right but not quite, messages that seem to echo or repeat with slight variations. He looked out over the flooded town. My grandfather used to tell stories about times like this, after major floods or tornadoes. Said the land remembers, that strong emotions and violent events can leave impressions that echo for years afterward. Said you couldn't trust anything you heard on the radio during those times because you never knew if you were getting a live transmission or something older, something that shouldn't still be broadcasting. Elmer wanted to dismiss that as superstitious nonsense, but standing on top of a water tower in the middle of a flooded ghost town in the dead of night, he found he couldn't quite manage it. The storm had felt wrong from the beginning, malevolent and intentional. The town had been evacuated, but Vernon had stayed behind, almost like he'd been waiting for something. And now the radio was delivering messages that felt like they were coming from somewhere else, sometime else, filtered through layers of interference that made them sound almost but not quite human. "We should try to sleep," Vernon said, settling down with his back against the water tower's central column. "Take shifts, one of us watching while the other rests. Dawn's still hours away, and we'll need our strength when rescue arrives." He pulled his rain slicker tighter around himself. "You take first watch. Wake me in 2 hours, or if anything changes." Elmer wanted to argue that there was no way he could sleep under these conditions, but Vernon's eyes were already closing, his breathing evening out into the rhythm of someone who'd mastered the art of sleeping anywhere under any circumstances. Probably a skill he'd developed over decades of law enforcement in a rural area where comfort was a luxury and rest was grabbed whenever possible. So Elmer stood his watch, pacing the small platform to keep his blood moving and stave off the cold. The floodwaters below continued to recede slowly, revealing more of the town's devastation with each passing hour. Cars overturned and wrapped around light poles, buildings with their walls collapsed or roofs torn off. Debris scattered everywhere in patterns that suggested the water's violent passage. His truck was visible now, or what was left of it. The cab had been pushed against a building and partially crushed, and the trailer had separated and was lying on its side 3 blocks away. His cargo was gone, his livelihood potentially ruined, all because he'd chosen the wrong day to drive through Kansas. The radio came to life again around 2 in the morning, and this time Elmer grabbed it before Vernon could wake. Clara Jean's voice came through, but it sounded different again. Younger somehow, and with an accent he hadn't noticed before. Meridian Falls Water Tower. Can you hear me? This is Clara Jean. I need you to listen very carefully. The rescue team that's coming, they're not... Static swallowed the rest of the message. Elmer pressed the transmit button. Clara Jean, you're breaking up. Can you repeat that last part? The rescue team is not what? More static, and then her voice came back, older now, rougher, like she'd aged years in the span of seconds. Not who they say they are. Been trying to warn people for how long has it been? Can't remember anymore. Just know you can't trust them. Don't go with them when they come. Stay on the tower. Wait for the real rescue. Clara Jean, you're not making sense. Are you okay? Where are you calling from? Elmer's hand was shaking as he held the radio, and he was acutely aware of Vernon stirring awake behind him, drawn by the sound of the transmission. The voice that came back was definitely not Clara Jean anymore, though it was still female. Older, harder, with an edge of desperation or madness that made Elmer's skin crawl. Stayed too long. Thought I could help. Thought someone would come. But the water keeps rising and falling and rising again. How many times now? Can't remember. Just stay on the tower. Don't trust what you see. Don't trust what you hear. Especially don't trust the voices on the radio. The transmission ended with a sound that might have been a scream or might have been just feedback. Vernon was fully awake now, standing next to Elmer with his hand out for the radio. Elmer gave it to him, and the sheriff tried to call back, but once again the radio was completely dead, not even static coming through. "Tell me you heard that too," Elmer said quietly. "Tell me I'm not losing my mind up here." Vernon set the radio down carefully, as if it might explode. "I heard it, and I'm starting to think my grandfather's stories weren't just old man superstition. Something's wrong with this place. Has been wrong for a while, probably. The evacuation order, the timing of the flood, the radio messages that don't quite make sense. It all feels orchestrated somehow, like we're being guided through a script we can't see." Elmer looked out at the flooded town, at the water reflecting the moonlight that had finally broken through the storm clouds. In the silvery illumination, he could see things floating in the floodwater that he hadn't noticed before. Not just debris and wreckage, but shapes that might have been bodies or might have been bundles of clothing, or might have been nothing at all, just shadows and imagination. "What do you think is really going on here, Vernon? And please don't tell me ghosts or spirits or anything supernatural. I need a rational explanation." Vernon was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "I think Meridian Falls has flooded before. Multiple times, probably, and I think people have been stranded here before, maybe on this very water tower, waiting for rescue that came too late or not at all. Radio equipment can be funny during atmospheric disturbances, especially old equipment like what we've got. Signals can bounce off the ionosphere, can travel hundreds of miles, can even be stored and repeated by certain conditions. Maybe what we're hearing isn't Clara Jean at all. Maybe it's old transmissions, recordings of previous floods and previous emergencies playing back through some quirk of physics or equipment malfunction." It was a rational explanation, exactly what Elmer had asked for, but it didn't explain the feeling of intentionality behind the messages, the sense that someone or something was actively trying to communicate with them or warn them or manipulate them. It didn't explain why the messages seemed to be responding to their questions, even if the answers didn't quite make sense. And it certainly didn't explain the scream at the end of that last transmission. The rest of the night passed slowly, marked by more radio transmissions that came at irregular intervals, Sometimes it was Clara Jean's voice, sometimes other voices, male and female and occasionally childlike, all delivering fragmentary warnings or reassurances or incomprehensible messages that faded in and out of static. Vernon and Elmer stopped responding after a while, just listened to the voices and tried to find patterns or meaning in the chaos. But there was no pattern Elmer could discern, just random phrases and warnings and promises that help was coming or had already come or would never come. Dawn arrived slowly, the sun rising over the Kansas plains and illuminating the full extent of the devastation. The water had receded significantly overnight, dropping to maybe waist-deep in most areas, and revealing a landscape transformed by the flood's violence. Vernon's town was essentially gone, every building damaged or destroyed, every street filled with mud and debris, every vehicle overturned or relocated. It would take months to clean up, years to rebuild, and the town might never recover at all. Small, rural communities didn't bounce back from disasters like this, not in modern America where resources flowed to cities and suburbs and left the heartland to fend for itself. Around 7 in the morning, they heard the helicopter before they saw it, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of rotors cutting through the morning air. It appeared from the east, a Bell 412 in the red and white colors of the Kansas Department of Emergency Management, flying low over the floodwaters and heading directly toward the water tower. Vernon waved both arms over his head, and Elmer did the same, and the helicopter circled once before moving into a hover about 50 feet away from the tower. A voice came over a loudspeaker mounted on the helicopter's nose. "Sheriff Huxley and civilian survivor, this is Kansas Emergency Management Flight Rescue 7. We're going to lower a basket for extraction. Please wait for the basket to reach the platform and then secure yourselves one at a time for lift. Do not attempt to climb or jump. Do you understand?" Vernon grabbed the dead radio and held it up, shaking his head and making gestures to indicate their radio wasn't working. The helicopter pilot seemed to understand, giving a thumbs up through the cockpit window. A moment later, a rescue basket began descending from a winch on the helicopter's side, swaying slightly in the rotor wash as it was lowered toward the platform. "Finally," Elmer breathed. "Finally, we're getting out of here." He was already moving toward the edge of the platform, ready to grab the basket as soon as it was close enough. But Vernon caught his arm, his grip surprisingly strong for a man in his 70s. "Wait." "Wait for what?" Elmer demanded. "That's our rescue. That's how we get off this tower and out of this nightmare. What are we waiting for?" Vernon was staring at the helicopter, his eyes narrowed against the rotor wash and morning sun. Something's wrong. That's not a Kansas Emergency Management helicopter. The colors are close but not quite right, and the registration number on the tail, it doesn't follow the standard format for state emergency vehicles. And look at the pilot, really look. Elmer looked, squinting against the glare. The pilot was visible through the cockpit window, wearing a flight suit and helmet, but something about the image was off. The figure seemed too still, too rigid, like a mannequin or a photograph rather than a living person. And as he watched, he realized he couldn't see the pilot's face at all, just darkness beneath the helmet's visor, deeper darkness than any shadow should be. "Don't trust the voices on the radio." That's what the transmission had said last night, the one that had ended in a scream. Especially, don't trust the voices. The loudspeaker crackled to life again. "Sheriff, we need you to board the rescue basket immediately. Weather conditions are deteriorating and we have multiple other rescues to perform. Please comply with extraction procedures." But the sky was clear now. No weather deterioration visible anywhere. And the voice on the loudspeaker, now that Elmer was listening carefully, had that same odd, flat quality as some of the radio transmissions from the night. Almost, but not quite human, like something imitating speech without fully understanding the emotional undertones that made it genuine. Vernon's hand was still gripping Elmer's arm, tight enough to hurt. "We don't get in that basket. Whatever's in that helicopter, wherever it would take us, it's not rescue. Trust your instincts, trucker. You feel it too, don't you? The wrongness of it?" Elmer nodded slowly. He did feel it. That same visceral sense of danger that had kept him alive through 3 decades on the road. The helicopter was hovering there, basket swaying in the rotor wash, loudspeaker repeating its commands for them to board, and every instinct Elmer had was screaming at him not to get in that basket, not to trust this rescue, not to leave the water tower no matter how desperate their situation seemed. "Then what do we do?" he asked Vernon. "We can't stay up here forever. We have no food, no water, no way to communicate. Even if this helicopter isn't legitimate rescue, we need to get off this tower somehow." Vernon finally released his arm and moved to the opposite side of the platform, away from the hovering helicopter. "We wait. The real rescue will come eventually. The state knows this town was evacuated, knows I stayed behind, knows there's been a major flood. They'll send someone to check on us, someone legitimate. We just have to wait them out, wait for whatever this is to give up and leave." The loudspeaker's voice became more insistent, losing some of its flat quality and gaining emotion that sounded like anger or frustration. "Sheriff Huxley, this is your final warning. Board the rescue basket immediately, or we will be forced to leave you behind. This is your only chance for extraction. Do not refuse rescue." "We refuse," Vernon shouted back, his voice carrying clearly across the distance despite the rotor noise. "We'll wait for legitimate emergency services. You can leave now." For a long moment, nothing happened. The helicopter just hovered there, basket still swaying from the winch, loudspeaker silent. Then, slowly, the basket began to retract, winding back up toward the helicopter. The aircraft held its position for another 30 seconds, and Elmer got the distinct impression they were being watched, evaluated, judged, in some way he couldn't understand. Then the helicopter banked sharply and accelerated away, heading back east the way it had come. Within seconds it was a speck on the horizon, and then it was gone completely, leaving Elmer and Vernon alone on the water tower once again. Elmer's legs felt weak, and he sat down heavily on the platform. What just happened? What was that thing? And how did you know not to trust it? Vernon was still staring after the departed helicopter, his expression troubled. "I've been sheriff of Meridian Falls for 42 years. In that time, I've seen 3 major floods, 2 tornadoes, countless severe storms, and every single time, without fail, there are reports afterward of strange rescues. Helicopters or boats that show up before official emergency services, offering to evacuate people, and those people are never seen again, listed as missing, presumed drowned, but their bodies are never found. I always dismiss the reports as confusion in the chaos, people misremembering what happened or conflating different events. But now," he trailed off, leaving the thought incomplete. But Elmer understood what he meant. Now they'd experienced it firsthand, had seen the fake rescue helicopter, and felt the wrongness of it, and could no longer dismiss the stories as confusion or superstition. "So we really are stuck here," Elmer said flatly. "Because we can't trust any rescue that shows up, can't know if it's legitimate or another one of those things. We could refuse genuine help because we're too paranoid, or we could accept help from something that wants to, what, kill us, take us somewhere? What's the endgame here?" Vernon didn't have an answer, just shook his head and settled back down with his back against the water tower. "We wait, we watch, and we hope that when real rescue comes we'll be able to tell the difference." The day passed slowly, the sun climbing high and beating down on the platform with surprising intensity. Elmer's lips cracked and bled from dehydration and his throat felt like sandpaper. They'd been without water for over 12 hours now, and the heat was making it worse. Vernon seemed to be suffering too, though he complained less, just sat in the shade of the water tower and conserved his energy. Around noon, Elmer heard the radio crackle to life one more time. He grabbed it, desperate for any information or hope, and Clara Jean's voice came through crystal clear. No static at all. "Elmer Dade and Sheriff Vernon Huxley, this is Emergency Services Coordinator Clara Jean Pickett. I have genuine rescue inbound to your location. ETA 20 minutes. 2 Kansas Highway Patrol helicopters with full emergency medical teams. When they arrive, you will be asked to provide a code phrase that only real rescue teams would know. The phrase is Sunflower State Protocol 7. If they don't use that exact phrase, do not board. Do you copy?" Vernon took the radio from Elmer's hand. "We copy, Clara Jean. Sunflower State Protocol 7. But how do we know this transmission is legitimate? How do we know you're really you?" The pause was briefer this time, and when Clara Jean spoke again, her voice carried a weight of genuine exhaustion and emotion. "You don't, Sheriff. That's the hell of it. You just have to make your best guess and hope you're right. But I'm giving you the code phrase because it's the only tool I have to help you. Real rescue teams have been briefed on it. Whatever else is out there, they won't know it. That's the best I can do." The radio went dead again, and Elmer and Vernon looked at each other. "Sunflower State Protocol 7, Elmer repeated. "You think that's real?" "No idea," Vernon admitted. "But it's something to test against. If rescue shows up and uses that phrase, we probably get in the helicopter. If they don't use it, we refuse. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing." 23 minutes later, 2 helicopters appeared from the west. Proper highway patrol aircraft with correct markings and multiple crew members visible through the windows. They approached the water tower carefully, and one hovered at a safe distance while the other moved in to lower a rescue basket. The loudspeaker crackled, and a male voice came through, professional and clipped. "Sheriff Huxley, Elmer Dade, this is Kansas Highway Patrol Rescue. We're here to extract you under Sunflower State Protocol 7. Please board the basket one at a time and we'll have you to safety within 10 minutes. Do you copy?" Vernon and Elmer exchanged a look. The phrase matched. The helicopters looked legitimate. The crew appeared to be real people, moving naturally. No signs of the wrongness they'd felt with the earlier helicopter. This seemed like genuine rescue. But as Elmer moved toward the basket that was being lowered toward the platform, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The phrase could have been intercepted, could have been heard by whatever was out there imitating rescue services. Using the code didn't prove anything except that the entity was smart enough to listen and adapt. He looked at Vernon, trying to communicate his uncertainty without words. The old sheriff seemed to understand. He keyed the radio one more time, even though it had been dead for hours, and spoke into it. "Clara Jean, if you can hear this, we need secondary confirmation, something only you and I would know, something we talked about the last time I was at the county office." Static, dead air, no response. The helicopter pilot's voice came over the loudspeaker again, more insistent now. "Sheriff, we need to complete this extraction quickly. Weather is changing and we have other rescues to perform. Please board the basket." Vernon stood at the edge of the platform, staring at the basket that swayed just a few feet away. Elmer stood beside him, both of them frozen with indecision. Get in and potentially be rescued, or refuse and potentially doom themselves to death by dehydration on this water tower. Trust their instincts or trust the code phrase. It should have been an easy choice, but Elmer found he couldn't make it. The radio crackled one more time, so faint he almost missed it under the helicopter noise. Clara Jean's voice barely a whisper. "You asked me about my mother's pie recipe. said you wanted to make it for the county fair. I told you the secret was—" Static swallowed the rest, but it was enough. Vernon nodded and reached for the basket. "That's real. That's her. Let's go, trucker. We're getting off this tower." Elmer climbed into the basket first, secured the harness, and gave a thumbs up. The winch hummed to life, and he was lifted away from the water tower up toward the waiting helicopter. As he rose, he looked down at Meridian Falls spread out below him, the flooded wreckage of a town that might never recover. And in the floodwater, he saw them clearly now in the bright daylight. Not debris or shadows, but bodies. Dozens of them, maybe more, floating face down in the brown water. People who hadn't escaped the flood, or people who'd accepted the wrong rescue, or people who'd been here for years or decades, trapped by whatever dark force seemed to infest this place during disasters. He was pulled into the helicopter, and hands grabbed him, real human hands with warmth and strength, pulling him inside and unclipping the harness. A medic wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and offered water that tasted like the finest thing he'd ever drunk. He watched through the open door as the basket was lowered again for Vernon, as the old sheriff climbed in and was winched up to safety. As both helicopters turned and began flying west, away from Meridian Falls and toward haze and safety and civilization, Elmer looked back one last time. In the flooded streets below, he could see movement now. Figures walking through the water, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all heading toward the water tower they'd just left. Not floating or swimming, but walking purposefully through waist-deep water like it wasn't there, heading toward where he and Vernon had been trapped. He turned away and didn't look back again. At the hospital in Hayes, they were treated for dehydration and exposure and minor injuries. Elmer was released after 6 hours with instructions to rest and follow up with his regular doctor. Vernon was kept overnight for observation given his age, but the doctor said he'd be fine. Clara Jean Pickett came to visit them both, a woman in her early 30s with tired eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach them. "I'm glad you made it out," she said to Elmer. "We lost contact with Meridian Falls for almost 18 hours. I was starting to think we'd have 2 more names to add to the missing list." Elmer wanted to ask her about the radio transmissions, about the code phrase and the fake helicopter, and the bodies in the floodwater. But looking at her exhausted face, he found he didn't have the heart. Maybe she knew about the strangeness that surrounded Meridian Falls during floods. Maybe she'd been fighting it for years, trying to save people with code phrases and warnings transmitted over compromised radio equipment. Or maybe she was just a dedicated emergency services coordinator doing her job the best she could, and all the weird stuff had been in his head, brought on by dehydration and stress and fear. He thanked her and left the hospital, finding his way to a truck stop where he called his company to explain about the lost truck and cargo. They were understanding, given the circumstances, told him to take a few days off and not worry about the equipment. Everything was insured, and he wasn't being held responsible for an act of God. But lying in a cheap motel room that night, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, Elmer couldn't stop thinking about Meridian Falls, about the water tower and the radio voices and the fake rescue helicopter, about the bodies in the floodwater and the figures walking through it like it wasn't there, about Vernon's stories of previous floods and people who accepted rescue and were never seen again. Most of all, he thought about Clara Jean's voice on the radio, all those different versions of it, young and old, panicked and calm, warning and reassuring. How many of them had been real? How many had been recordings or echoes or something else entirely? And the final transmission, the whispered reminder about a pie recipe that confirmed Vernon should trust the rescue. Had that really been her? Or had it been something clever enough to intercept their communications and learn enough to fake authenticity? He didn't have answers. He suspected he never would. But he knew with absolute certainty that he'd never drive through Kansas again if he could help it. Some roads were better left untraveled. Some towns better left alone, especially during storms when the radio crackled with voices that shouldn't exist and rescue came in forms that couldn't be trusted. His phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. He almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity won out. Thank you for refusing the first helicopter. Most people don't. Most people trust the rescue that comes too quickly. You and Vernon are smart, lucky. Stay away from Meridian Falls. Stay away from small Kansas towns during floods. The water remembers, the voices remember, and they're always waiting for the next storm, CJ. Elmer deleted the message and turned off his phone. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but every time he started to drift off, he heard static. And in the static he heard voices calling his name, offering rescue, promising safety, trying to lure him back to that water tower and whatever waited below in the flooded streets. He never did sleep that night. And for months afterward, he couldn't listen to the radio without hearing echoes of those voices, warnings and promises tangled together in static that should have been empty but never quite was. Some rescues, he'd learned, were worse than drowning. And some voices on the radio should never be answered, no matter how desperately you needed help. He just hoped he'd remember that the next time a storm caught him in the middle of nowhere with nowhere safe to run.